My name is Clara Spencer. I am 36 and I move international freight for a living. I spend my days tracking cargo ships across oceans and untangling global supply chains, which means I know exactly how to route valuable things quietly. The ink on my divorce decree was still wet when my husband stood up from the conference table wearing the charcoal suit I bought him for Christmas. Nate smoothed the lapels and gave me a smile that felt like a physical blow. He had just taken our house in Denver, the joint investment accounts, and 12 years of my life. He leaned across the mahogany table smelling like expensive cologne he charged to a credit card I used to pay. "I am heading straight to my mother's for a family dinner," he said, checking his silver watch. It was a Tuesday. Family dinner was a code phrase. The entire town knew he was driving across the city to celebrate his engagement to Kelsey, a 26-year-old girl he met while I was home raising our 2 children. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to weep right there in front of the mediators. I did not give him the satisfaction. I just looked at him, calm and steady, and told him I hoped he enjoyed the celebration. What Nate did not know was that while his family was raising glasses to my replacement, I was reaching into my leather briefcase. My fingers brushed against 3 first-class tickets to Rome, printed for me and my children, Leo and Mia. Just hours from now, while Nate toasted to a financial empire he thought he had, a courier would arrive at his mother's front door with a single sealed folder. The Denver kingdom he fought so hard to steal was about to become his personal prison. Welcome back to Q to Told Stories, where quiet women face loud cruelty, and the truth takes its time, but always hits the mark. If you believe that patience is a better weapon than shouting, you are in the right place. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up a bit, because the smug smile started long before the ink dried. I had spent a decade building a career in global logistics, climbing from a cubicle to a director's office. I made sure our family had everything they needed. Nate was a commercial real estate broker who loved the appearance of wealth more than the work required to earn it. He drove European cars and hosted dinner parties where he held court talking about his big deals, while I quietly balanced the checkbook and managed the household deficits. Sitting in that sleek law office in downtown Denver, the imbalance was blinding. Nate's lawyer slid the final asset division across the desk. The terms were greedy. He demanded the primary residence and the entire portfolio of our shared American investments, treating my contributions as nothing more than an expected subsidy. His strategy was simple. He wanted to exhaust me with paperwork until I surrendered. I signed my name with a steady hand, handing over the keys to a life I built brick by brick. Nate practically beamed, sliding the decree into his designer briefcase. He thought he had outsmarted a woman who maps supply routes for global conglomerates. He assumed I was walking away empty-handed. People who confuse silence with stupidity usually figure out their mistake when it is too late to fix it. A week before the ink dried on those divorce papers, the social execution had already commenced. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon at the Oak Ridge Country Club, a place where Denver high society gathered to compare net worth and trade gossip over iced tea. The mountain air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and expensive sunscreen. I was only there to drop off a check for my son Leo's upcoming tennis lessons, an errand that should have taken 5 minutes. Instead, I found myself cornered on the sunlit patio by Patricia Collins. Patricia was a woman who wore her social standing like a suit of armor. She possessed perfectly coiffed blonde hair that defied the Colorado wind, and a practiced smile that never quite reached her cold eyes. For 12 years, I was the quiet, working daughter-in-law who funded her pristine country club lifestyle, while she pretended her son was the sole financial pillar of our family. Now that Nate had found Kelsey a girl young enough to hang on his every boastful word, Patricia was eager to rewrite the marriage. She spotted me by the clubhouse double doors and glided over, trailed by 3 of her closest friends. These were women who thrived on scandal, their eyes gleaming with anticipated drama as they formed a tight semicircle around me. Patricia did not lower her voice. In fact, she projected it, ensuring every table on the terrace caught the performance. "Clara, darling," she crooned, placing a manicured hand firmly on my forearm. Her grip was tight, almost restrictive. "We are all just so heartbroken for you. But really, you cannot blame Nate. A man needs warmth. He needs a wife who is present, not a corporate drone who is too obsessed with her spreadsheets to keep him happy." The patio went entirely silent. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain stopped. Everyone waited for my reaction. They expected me to flush with embarrassment, to raise my voice, or to run toward the parking lot in tears. Patricia was starving for a scene. She wanted to prove to her wealthy friends that I was the bitter cold woman her son claimed I was. Instead, I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then met her gaze. I did not flinch. I did not defend my spreadsheets, the very spreadsheets that had quietly paid the mortgage on the sprawling house where she hosted her weekly bridge club. I let the heavy silence stretch. In global logistics, you learn very quickly that reacting emotionally to a crisis only creates a secondary disaster. You assess the variables, you form a plan, and you execute without hesitation. "Patricia," I said, my voice level and incredibly polite, "I appreciate your concern. I truly hope Nate finds exactly what he is looking for." I gently removed her hand from my arm, nodded respectfully to her stunned friends, and walked away. My pulse remained steady. Patricia stared after me, her mouth slightly open in shock. She had set a trap for a screaming match, and I had simply stepped around it. That was their fatal flaw. Nate and his mother confused my calm demeanor with weakness. They thought my silence meant I was stupid. Now, standing in the master bedroom of the Denver house, that silence was my greatest asset. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I pulled 2 sturdy duffel bags from the closet for Leo and Mia. I was not packing for a quick weekend trip. I was packing for a new reality. My movements were methodical, driven by the same precise focus I used to route shipping containers across the Atlantic Ocean. I walked over to the sprawling walk-in closet and began sorting through a decade of accumulated possessions. I ignored the designer dresses Nate had purchased for me to wear to his corporate dinners, garments chosen to make me look like a suitable accessory. I bypassed the flashy diamond tennis bracelet he bought 2 years ago to smooth over a weekend he disappeared on a supposed business trip. Those items were props in a play I was no longer starring in. They stayed in Colorado. I packed only the essentials: sensible clothing, Leo's favorite worn-out stuffed bear, Mia's sketch pads, a few framed photographs, and the thick leather-bound ledgers I had maintained for a decade. Those ledgers held the true, unfiltered story of the Collins family empire. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every hidden debt Nate tried to sweep under the rug to maintain his image. I ran my fingers over the embossed cover of the newest volume. Nate never understood the profound value of meticulous record-keeping. He lived in the moment, chasing the next big commercial commission, the next luxury car lease, the next young admirer. He thought wealth was something you projected to strangers. I knew wealth was something you protected from predators. I placed the ledgers securely at the very bottom of my carry-on bag. As I zipped the final duffel bag shut, my phone buzzed on the mahogany nightstand. The screen lit up with a new message from Patricia. Even on the day her son finalized his divorce, she could not resist twisting the knife one last time. I opened the message and read the glowing text. "Do not worry about dropping the kids off this weekend," it read. "Nate and Kelsey need time to celebrate their future together. Keep them with you." I read the cruel words twice. A grandmother casually tossing her own grandchildren aside so her son could pop expensive champagne with a mistress. It was a calculated insult, designed to make me feel isolated and burdened by my own children. It was meant to sting, to remind me that my kids and I were no longer welcome in their golden circle. But Patricia did not realize she was handing me the exact logistical clearance I needed. Nate had a terrible habit of treating Leo and Mia as inconvenient accessories, useful for holiday greeting cards, but bothersome on a Saturday night. I did not need to fight a bitter legal battle for weekend custody. They were eagerly handing it over on a silver platter. I typed my response, keeping my tone brief and devoid of any emotional weight. Understood. They will not be in your way. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the bed. I felt a profound sense of clarity wash over me. The physical packing was finished, but the financial extraction required one final, delicate step. I sat down at the small writing desk in the corner of the bedroom and opened my laptop. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I opened a secure browser and navigated to an offshore banking portal. The interface was austere, stripped of the colorful marketing graphics used by domestic retail banks. It required a physical two-factor authentication token and a complex alphanumeric password. I typed the long sequence, my keystrokes echoing in the empty room. The screen loaded, displaying a balance that would make Nate's jaw unhinge. This was not marital money. This was capital I had meticulously untangled from our joint accounts months before the divorce proceedings even began. I utilized obscure clauses in our original prenuptial agreement clauses that Nate had been too eager and too arrogant to read carefully 12 years ago. I navigated to the Pending Transactions tab. One final movement of funds remained in the queue. It was a significant sum, the last liquid resource tied to my name in the United States. The destination was a secure, irrevocable trust in Europe. It was a trust governed by international laws Nate had zero jurisdiction over. I hovered my cursor over the execute button. This was the point of no return. Once this transfer cleared, the American accounts would reflect exactly what Nate demanded in the settlement agreement. He would inherit a hollow shell of assets chained to a mountain of toxic corporate liabilities. He demanded everything, and I was giving him exactly what he asked for. I clicked the button. A small loading circle spun on the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, a green confirmation checkmark appeared. Transfer successful. The funds were gone, slipping across international borders faster than any commercial flight could carry them. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, reflecting my own steady gaze. The trap was locked. While Nate and Kelsey prepared to toast their bright new future across town, the financial ground beneath their feet had already vanished. Across town, inside the gilded walls of Patricia Collins' sprawling Cherry Creek estate, a different kind of reality was being constructed. The mansion was a monument to old Denver money, featuring soaring ceilings and imported marble floors. Upstairs in the opulent guest suite, Nate adjusted the knot of his silk tie in a full-length antique mirror. He was riding the potent high of his perceived courtroom victory. Kelsey sat perched on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge, sipping sparkling water and scrolling through bridal accounts on her phone. She was radiant, polished, and fiercely determined to secure the lifestyle she believed she deserved. Nate needed to cement his status as her wealthy savior. He walked over to his designer leather bag, pulled out a thick bound folder, and dropped it casually onto her lap. He told her to look at the bottom line. It was a property appraisal report. What Kelsey did not know was that Nate had called a favor from a morally flexible college buddy to inflate the numbers. The document falsely valued the marital assets he just stripped from me at a staggering $7 million. Kelsey traced her manicured finger over the inflated digits, her eyes widening with genuine delight. She looked up at him breathless, calling him a genius. Nate soaked in the praise, his ego swelling to fill the cavernous room. He truly believed he was untouchable. But the facade demanded constant funding. Kelsey set the folder aside and gracefully stood up, wrapping her arms around his neck. She whispered that since they were starting their lives as a millionaire couple, they needed a wedding that reflected their new status. She did not want a local country club affair. She wanted a destination wedding on the Amalfi Coast. She outlined her vision with rapid precision. Custom floral arrangements imported from Holland, a chartered yacht for the rehearsal dinner, and a designer gown that required 3 trips to Paris for fittings. The projected cost was $150,000. A sharp knot of panic tightened in Nate's chest. He did not possess $150,000 in liquid cash. His bank accounts were stretched dangerously thin from maintaining his luxury car leases and the expensive dinners required to woo her. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the reality of his depleted checking account threatening to break through his arrogant exterior. Kelsey noticed the slight pause. Her smile faltered, her tone dropping a subtle octave as she asked if a destination wedding was too much for his budget. Nate's pride could not handle the implied insult. The very foundation of their relationship was built on his ability to provide unlimited luxury. He forced a confident laugh, kissing her forehead. He assured her that $150,000 was trivial. He promised her she could have the Amalfi Coast and anything else her heart desired. As she squealed and went back to scrolling through venue options, Nate's mind raced frantically, calculating his next move. The solution seemed obvious to him. He had just won the primary Denver residence in the divorce settlement. The home had equity. He would simply take out a secondary line of credit against the property to fund the extravagant Italian wedding. He was borrowing against a house of cards, convinced the structure was made of solid steel. Simultaneously, 20 miles away, the automatic doors of Denver International Airport slid open. The terminal was a symphony of rolling luggage and echoing announcements. I guided 9-year-old Leo and 7-year-old Mia through the bustling crowds with practiced ease. Navigating complex logistical challenges was my profession. Moving 2 children through international security was a simple exercise in efficiency. Mia held tightly to my left hand, while Leo pulled his small wheeled suitcase with quiet determination. I handed our passports to the ticketing agent, feeling the familiar, reassuring texture of the navy blue booklets. While the agent processed our boarding passes, my thoughts drifted to my late father. He was a forensic accountant who trusted cold mathematics far more than he trusted human promises. Long before I ever met Nate, my father sat me down at our kitchen table and taught me the paramount importance of maintaining separate, untraceable trusts. He insisted that a woman must always keep an emergency door unlocked, a financial sanctuary that no partner could ever breach. I followed his strict guidance to the letter. 7 years ago, my maternal grandmother passed away and left me her most prized possession. It was not a sprawling American estate, but a historic stone-walled villa tucked away in the rolling hills of Tuscany, Italy. The property was centuries old, surrounded by ancient olive groves and terraced vineyards. Nate despised the villa. He viewed the world through the narrow lens of quick flips and commercial commissions. To him, an aging Italian property was nothing but a useless tax drain, a crumbling liability that did not yield immediate American dollars. During the most heated negotiations of our divorce, the villa became a pivotal bargaining chip. Nate practically shoved the deed back across the mediation table. He loudly demanded that I retain sole ownership of the overseas property, using it as justification to claim all the liquid domestic accounts and the valuable Denver real estate. He argued that since he was taking the lucrative domestic portfolio, it was only fair that I get stuck with the European money pit. I played the part of the reluctant, defeated wife flawlessly. I hesitated, sighed, and finally agreed to sign the paperwork allowing him to dump the Italian property into my lap. What Nate failed to comprehend was that the villa was not a crumbling ruin. Under my discreet management and logistical routing, the estate had been fully restored into a high-end, income-producing boutique rental. The revenue generated by the European property flowed directly into an irrevocable international trust entirely shielded by foreign privacy laws. Nate handed me the keys to a fortress, assuming he was giving me a pile of rocks. The ticketing agent smiled, handing back our passports and 3 first-class boarding passes. She wished us a wonderful journey to Rome. I thanked her, slipping the documents into my leather tote. We moved through the security checkpoint without a single delay, the culmination of weeks of silent, flawless preparation. We walked toward our departure gate, the sprawling Rocky Mountains visible through the towering glass windows of the concourse. I bought Leo and Mia warm pretzels, settling them into the plush leather seats of the first-class lounge. They were excited, viewing the sudden relocation as a thrilling overseas adventure. I promised them gelato for dinner, watching the tension leave their small shoulders. Back at the Cherry Creek estate, the engagement party shifted into its main event. The grand ballroom was filled with Denver elite holding crystal flutes filled with imported champagne. Patricia Collins stood at the center of the room, beaming with matriarchal pride. She tapped a silver spoon against her glass, calling for silence. The murmurs faded as Nate and Kelsey descended the sweeping, curved staircase. They looked like the perfect society couple, glowing with unearned confidence. Nate took a glass from a passing waiter and stepped into the center of the room. He raised his arm, commanding the attention of the wealthy guests. He delivered a practiced, charismatic speech about new beginnings, enduring love, and the rewards of hard work. He thanked his mother for her unwavering support and looked deeply into Kelsey's eyes, promising her a lifetime of limitless prosperity. The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Nate drank his champagne, savoring the crisp, expensive taste of victory. At that exact moment, 50 miles away, the heavy wheels of our commercial airliner left the tarmac. The engines roared, pulling us up into the clear Colorado sky. I looked out the window, watching the sprawling grid of Denver shrink into tiny, insignificant squares below. My phone was already switched to airplane mode, severing my final connection to the toxic world Nate and Patricia inhabited. Nate stood in that crowded ballroom, basking in the adoration of his peers, entirely unaware of the lethal financial mechanism he had just triggered. He thought the Denver properties he fought so viciously to win were his stepping stones to an opulent future. He did not know those properties were inextricably chained to a toxic, ballooning corporate debt. He did not realize the liability assumption clause he signed without reading had just transferred over $3 million of commercial defaults directly onto his personal ledger. He was raising a glass to his own impending ruin, and I was already an ocean away. The heavy landing gear of our commercial airliner met the runway at Leonardo da Vinci Airport just as the early morning sun painted the European sky in shades of bruised apricot. We stepped out of the terminal, and the warm Mediterranean breeze immediately wrapped around us. The air here carried a rich scent of baked earth, dark espresso, and centuries of quiet survival. It was a profound, striking shift from the thin, artificial atmosphere of Cherry Creek. In our old Denver neighborhood, oxygen always felt rationed according to your tax bracket, and every interaction was a calculated measurement of social utility. Rome did not care about your country club membership or what brand of car you parked in the driveway. Rome had watched entire empires rise and fall into dust, which made the collapse of a 12-year marriage feel remarkably insignificant. I arranged a private black sedan to take us north into the rolling Tuscan countryside. As the experienced driver navigated the winding ancient roads bordered by towering cypress trees, the initial thrill of the long airplane ride began to wear off for my children. Mia pressed her forehead against the tinted glass, her small voice trembling as she asked when we were going back to her familiar bedroom with the pink walls. Leo sat rigidly beside her, clutching his canvas backpack, burdened by a sudden wave of displacement. This was the exact minor conflict I had prepared for. It is a delicate, intricate task to uproot a child without making them feel like fugitives fleeing a disaster. I reached across the soft leather seat and took their hands in mine. I did not offer them empty platitudes or false promises. I spoke to them with the respect their young minds deserved. I explained that we were not running away from Colorado, but rather stepping forward into a grand, deliberate new chapter. I told them stories about their great-grandmother, a woman of fierce independence and sharp intellect, who left us a legacy built on solid stone instead of borrowed money. I framed our journey as a strategic expedition, a chance to explore a world far larger than the suffocating bubble their father demanded we live in. I watched their breathing slow down. By the time our driver navigated the final curve of the long gravel driveway, the anxiety in my children's eyes had transformed into bright, wide-eyed wonder. The vehicle rolled to a smooth halt in front of the estate Nate had so eagerly discarded during our negotiations. He had always pictured a crumbling, romanticized ruin. He envisioned a damp money pit requiring endless capital just to keep the terracotta roof from caving in. The reality standing before us was vastly different, a testament to my quiet, methodical planning. The villa was a flawless execution of historical preservation married to modern, high-end luxury. Over the past 7 years, I had secretly funneled my annual corporate performance bonuses into restoring the property, utilizing my background in global logistics to source authentic materials and manage local contractors from an ocean away. The pale stone facade glowed in the Tuscan afternoon light, flanked by manicured botanical gardens and a sprawling infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the lush vineyard below. This was not a liability. It was Villa Alba, a premier boutique estate booking exclusive retreats for international corporate executives at premium nightly rates. The revenue it generated alone eclipsed Nate's best annual real estate commissions. A dedicated local staff, managed by an impeccable estate director named Elena, stood waiting by the arched mahogany doors to welcome us with fresh linens and warm meals. Nate handed me the keys to an appreciating gold mine, simply because he was too lazy to look past his own prejudice. We walked through the grand entryway, our footsteps echoing on the reclaimed vintage floors, leaving the hollow American dream permanently behind us. While my children were eagerly choosing their new bedrooms overlooking the sunlit hills, the engagement celebration in Colorado was reaching its chaotic, glittering peak. The champagne flowed, generously paid for by a man who was quietly hemorrhaging cash. Patricia held court near an elaborate ice sculpture, her voice carrying sharply over the hired string quartet. She cornered a group of influential local politicians and wealthy neighbors, bragging loudly about Kelsey's refined taste and youthful energy. My former mother-in-law proudly declared to anyone who would listen that her son had finally found a partner who truly understands his ambition and supports his grand vision. She painted a picture of a triumphant dynasty, entirely ignorant of the rot eating away at its foundation. Nate stood across the lavish room wearing his tailored suit and a smile that was beginning to strain at the corners. He was holding Kelsey's hand, playing the role of the affluent groom to perfection. He laughed at jokes he did not find funny and nodded at advice he had no intention of taking. Yet a silent, relentless conflict was brewing right inside his breast pocket. His sleek smartphone vibrated against his ribs. He ignored it, taking another long sip of his drink. 5 minutes later, the device buzzed again. Then a third time in rapid, urgent succession. The persistent vibration felt like a physical tap on his shoulder, demanding his attention. He excused himself from a conversation with a local real estate developer, claiming he needed to check on the catering staff. He slipped away from the crowded ballroom and retreated into the dim, quiet hallway near the coat check. He pulled the phone from his pocket, half expecting congratulatory text messages from absent friends or jealous colleagues. Instead, the glowing screen displayed 3 high-priority email notifications. They were from the commercial lending division of his primary bank, the institution holding the notes on his brokerage firm. The subject lines contained clinical, terrifying phrases. Account deficit detected. Urgent action required regarding collateral. Immediate review of commercial obligations. Nate stared at the glowing letters, the color draining slightly from his face. For a fleeting second, the truth threatened to pierce his thick armor of denial. He knew he had stretched his credit limits to the breaking point to fund the diamond jewelry, the designer clothes, and the grand illusion of limitless wealth required to keep Kelsey interested. He knew the commercial real estate market had been soft, and his recent commissions were sparse. But the music swelled in the ballroom behind him, and Kelsey called his name from the dance floor, her voice echoing with the promise of adoration. His ego, fragile and dangerously oversized, overrode his common sense. Facing the financial reality meant admitting his entire life was a performance, and he was fundamentally incapable of that kind of honesty. He swiped the notifications away without opening a single email. He chose the comforting, warm delusion of the party over the harsh, cold mathematics waiting in his inbox. He slid the phone back into his pocket, adjusted his expensive tie, and walked back into the bright celebration, entirely blind to the catastrophic countdown he had just ignored. He thought he was the master of his domain, but the timer on his financial bomb had just clicked down to 0. The morning sun climbed over the rolling hills of Tuscany, casting a golden light across the stone terrace of Villa Alba. I sat at a small wrought iron table, the air carrying the scent of wild rosemary and damp earth. A ceramic cup of espresso rested in my hands. The dark, bitter liquid sharpened my focus, cutting through the lingering exhaustion of the transatlantic flight. My children were sleeping soundly in their rooms upstairs, their breathing steady and peaceful. For the first time in over a decade, I did not have to tiptoe around a sleeping husband who demanded pristine silence to cure his latest hangover. I set the cup down and opened my silver laptop. Due to the 9-hour time difference, the morning light in Italy meant the evening was just reaching its peak back in Colorado. I connected to the Secure Estate Network and opened a direct, encrypted communication channel with my Denver-based attorney, Morgan. Morgan was a former corporate litigator who transitioned to family law. She possessed a sharp, unsentimental mind that aligned perfectly with my own logistical training. We did not trade emotional pleasantries. We traded precise, actionable data. I typed a single brief sentence confirming my arrival and granting her the authorization to initiate the final sequence. The trap we built was a masterpiece of legal architecture hidden in plain sight. During the most grueling rounds of divorce mediation, I utilized a core principle of supply chain management. When negotiating a volatile contract, you allow the opposing party to win the superficial arguments while you quietly dictate the foundational terms. Nate fought bitterly for the Denver real estate and the commercial brokerage firm. He demanded those assets to maintain his wealthy facade. I feigned reluctance, shedding a few calculated tears, before finally allowing him to take the properties and the business. What Nate failed to comprehend was the dense 50-page settlement packet required to finalize the transfer. Buried deep within the boilerplate text on page 42 was a liability assumption clause. In the corporate world, you never accept a bulk transfer of assets without conducting an exhaustive, independent financial audit. You must inspect the cargo before assuming the risk. Nate, driven by his suffocating arrogance and his rush to finalize his engagement to Kelsey, refused the audit. He considered the process a waste of time and an insult to his own perceived brilliance. He signed a waiver, explicitly declining his right to review the books. By signing that waiver and demanding the assets, Nate legally bound himself to the liabilities attached to them. He assumed the brokerage firm was a fountain of pure equity. He did not know I had spent the last 2 years untangling my personal credit from the business, leaving the firm exposed to its own toxic, ballooning corporate debt. The commercial loans were deeply underwater. By claiming the company, he claimed the crushing debt, shielding me from the fallout. He wanted the kingdom, and I handed him a collapsing castle. While I watched the confirmation receipt appear on my laptop screen, the engagement celebration in Cherry Creek was reaching a fever pitch. The grand living room glowed under the light of 3 crystal chandeliers. A hired string quartet played a lively symphony in the corner, their music blending with the hum of affluent conversation. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd, offering silver trays of seared scallops and imported caviar. Nate stood near the towering marble fireplace feeling like a conquering king. He held a crystal flute of expensive champagne, the bubbles rising in a steady golden stream. Kelsey clung to his left arm wearing a designer silk dress that clung to her frame. She looked up at him with unblinking adoration, securing her role as the devoted future wife. Patricia watched them from a few feet away, her chest swelling with pride. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of generational wealth, desperate to hide the fact that her late husband left her a very modest estate. Nate was her proxy, her golden ticket to permanent high society relevance. Nate tapped a silver spoon against the rim of his glass. The sharp, clear chime cut through the ambient noise of the party. The guests paused their conversations and turned their attention toward the fireplace. The string quartet faded into silence. Nate offered a practiced, charismatic smile, the kind of expression he used to close real estate deals with hesitant buyers. He began his speech by thanking his mother for hosting the beautiful gathering, praising her elegant taste and enduring support. Patricia placed a hand over her heart, soaking in the public validation. He then turned his gaze to the crowd, raising his glass slightly higher. He spoke about the challenges of navigating life, making vague, polite references to the hurdles he recently overcame. It was a thinly veiled jab at our marriage, a subtle way to assure his wealthy peers that shedding his previous wife was a necessary step toward his ultimate success. He described building his commercial empire through sheer grit and unmatched vision. The audience nodded along, captivated by his confident delivery. Finally, he pulled Kelsey closer, kissing the crown of her head. He declared that a true visionary needs a partner who matches his ambition, someone who understands the demands of greatness. Kelsey beamed her diamond ring, catching the chandelier light. The crowd raised their glasses, murmuring their enthusiastic agreement. Just as Nate opened his mouth to deliver the final toast, a sharp, resonant sound echoed through the grand foyer. The heavy brass doorbell chimed, interrupting the climax of his speech. A murmur rippled through the guests. A waiter instinctively moved toward the entryway, but Nate held up a hand, stopping him. High on the adrenaline of his own monologue, Nate decided to play the role of the gracious, approachable host. He chuckled, telling the crowd that a truly great party always attracts a few late arrivals. He handed his champagne flute to Kelsey and strode confidently across the Brazilian cherry hardwood floor. He pulled open the heavy mahogany front door, expecting to find a straggling local politician or a delayed business partner. Instead, a man wearing a plain, unremarkable windbreaker stood on the expansive front porch. He did not carry a gift or a bottle of wine. He held a thick, heavy manila envelope. The stranger looked at a small clipboard in his hand, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He asked if he was speaking to Nathaniel Collins. Nate, slightly confused but maintaining his charming facade, puffed out his chest and confirmed his identity. The man nodded, pulling the thick envelope from under his arm and pressing it firmly against Nate's chest. "Consider yourself served," the man said, his voice flat and professional. The stranger turned on his heel and walked rapidly down the slate pathway, disappearing into the cool Denver night. Nate stood in the open doorway, the cold air rushing into the warm foyer. He looked down at the envelope in his hands. It was unusually heavy, the thick paper sealed with bold red ink. He closed the front door and walked slowly back into the living room. The guests watched him with polite curiosity. Kelsey stepped forward, offering him his champagne flute. She asked him who was at the door. Patricia stepped into the center of the room, letting out a soft, knowing laugh. She waved her hand dismissively at the envelope. "Oh, do not worry, everyone," Patricia announced, her voice carrying a smug, victorious tone. "That is just the legal courier. The final divorce decrees were filed this week. Clara is finally out of our hair. It is the ultimate proof of a clean slate. Let us raise our glasses to a future unburdened by the past." The crowd chuckled, ready to resume their celebration. Nate managed a weak smile, eager to brush the interruption aside. He tucked his champagne flute under his arm and tore open the red seal of the envelope. He reached inside and pulled out a dense stack of legal documents. He flipped past the heavy cardstock cover to read the primary letterhead. It was not a divorce decree. It was a formal notice of default and immediate acceleration issued by the primary commercial lender holding the notes on his brokerage firm. Nate stopped breathing. His eyes scanned the clinical, terrifying paragraphs. The document outlined a catastrophic financial reality. The commercial loans attached to his firm had reached a critical deficit. The bank was exercising its right to call the entire debt due immediately. Nate frantically scanned the text for a loophole, assuming the corporate structure would shield his personal assets. Then his eyes landed on a specific paragraph highlighted in bold ink. The notice cited the liability assumption clause, the exact clause he signed away his right to review just days prior. The text plainly stated that Nathaniel Collins had legally assumed full personal responsibility for the outstanding balances. He was no longer shielded by corporate limits. He was personally on the hook for over $3 million in defaulted commercial debt. The assets he fought to steal from me were entirely underwater, and the bank was now targeting his personal accounts to satisfy the deficit. The ambient noise of the party faded into a dull, distant ringing in his ears. The wealthy guests, the sparkling chandeliers, the adoring gaze of his new fiancée, all of it dissolved into a blur. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably, the thick legal papers shaking in his grip. The numbness spread from his fingertips up through his arms. The crystal flute slipped from beneath his arm. Time seemed to slow down as the fragile glass fell toward the floor. It struck the Brazilian cherry hardwood with a sharp, crisp crack. The crystal shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the expensive champagne splashing across the polished wood, staining the hem of Kelsey's designer dress. The music stopped abruptly. The entire room fell into a stunned, heavy silence, watching the groom stare into the envelope that had just dismantled his entire life. The sound of shattering crystal echoed through the sprawling Cherry Creek living room like a gunshot. Champagne pooled around the fragmented glass, soaking into the pristine fibers of an imported rug. Nobody moved. The hired string quartet sat frozen, their bows hovering inches above their instruments. All eyes remained fixed on Nathaniel Collins. He stood rigid, staring at the thick stack of legal papers in his hands. The bold red lettering across the top page burned into his vision. Notice of immediate default. He reread the clinical paragraphs, praying his eyes were playing tricks on him. They were not. The commercial lender holding the notes on his brokerage firm was calling the debt, $3.2 million. During the divorce mediation, he demanded the firm. He thought the business was a golden goose. He never bothered to check if the goose was breathing. For years, the firm's ledgers were quietly propped up by my flawless credit rating and meticulous balance transfers. I used my logistics salary to patch the holes in his sinking ship, ensuring the corporate accounts remained in good standing. With my name legally severed from the business, the lender saw the raw, unfiltered truth. The brokerage was bleeding out. And because Nate signed that liability assumption clause, waiving his right to an independent audit, the corporate veil was pierced. The $3.2 million deficit was no longer an abstract business problem. It was his personal, inescapable obligation. The suffocating silence stretched until Patricia stepped forward. She navigated around the puddle of spilled champagne, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She wore a strained, expectant smile, eager to correct the awkward shift in the room's energy. Patricia had spent decades cultivating the illusion of generational wealth. Her late husband left her a very modest life insurance policy and a mountain of social ambition. She relied entirely on Nate's perceived success to maintain her country club status. "Nathaniel," she prompted, her voice tight with forced lightheartedness, "tell us what the courier brought. Give us the good news so we can get back to the toast." Nate did not answer. He could barely breathe. The walls of the lavish estate felt like they were closing in, pressing the oxygen out of his lungs. He swallowed hard, trying to shove the panic down, but his hands betrayed him, trembling violently against the crisp white paper. Patricia took another step closer, her patience fraying. She reached out to touch his arm. "Nathaniel, I am speaking to you. What does the letter say?" "Stop pushing me." The words tore out of his throat, harsh and uncontrolled. He snapped at his mother, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He ripped his arm away from her grasp. "I said, stop." The room flinched. Patricia recoiled as if she had been slapped. The matriarch of Denver High Society, a woman who demanded absolute deference from everyone in her orbit, was just reprimanded by her golden child in front of 60 influential guests. A flush of deep mottled red crept up her neck. Her carefully constructed world of manners and superiority fractured in an instant. Kelsey, sensing the tectonic shift in the power dynamic, leaned over Nate's shoulder. Before meeting Nate, Kelsey worked a low-wage reception job at a fitness center, scanning membership cards while searching for a wealthy man to fund her lifestyle. She thought she had found her lottery ticket. Her eyes darted across the exposed legal document in Nate's hands. She caught fragments of the terrifying text. Default. Acceleration. 3 million. Her perfectly glossed lips parted in confusion. "Nate," she whispered, her voice laced with genuine panic, "what does that mean? Why does it say $3 million? Nate scrambled to fold the papers, shoving them awkwardly back into the manila envelope. His mind raced desperately, searching for a plausible lie to plug the sinking ship. "It is nothing," he stammered, his trademark charisma shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He forced a wide, unconvincing laugh. "It is just a clerical error." Clara and her spiteful lawyers are trying to pull a fast one. They filed the wrong paperwork to try and ruin our evening. I will have my attorneys clear it up on Monday morning. It is a pathetic, desperate tactic. He looked around the room, begging his wealthy peers to buy the performance. But the Denver elite are predators wrapped in designer clothing. They can smell financial blood in the water from a mile away. The false bravado in his voice was unmistakable. The guests exchanged loaded, meaningful glances. The illusion of the triumphant, wealthy groom was disintegrating right in front of their eyes. While Nate's carefully constructed reality collapsed in Colorado, I was walking down a cobblestone street in the heart of Rome. The evening air was warm, filled with the hum of distant mopeds and the rich aroma of roasting garlic. The setting sun cast a golden, honeyed glow across the ancient architecture. Leo and Mia walked beside me, their faces illuminated by pure, unfiltered joy. We stopped at a small family-owned gelateria, tucked beneath a canopy of climbing ivy. I ordered 3 cups of authentic artisan gelato, stracciatella for Leo, bright pink strawberry for Mia, and dark espresso for myself. We sat on a weathered stone bench near a bubbling fountain, watching the city come alive under the twilight. Mia let out a soft, contented sigh. Her shoulders relaxed in a way I had not seen in months. There was no tension here. There were no hushed arguments behind closed doors, no walking on eggshells to appease a volatile ego. The peace was profound, anchored by the heavy historical weight of the city. I thought back to another lesson from my father. He used to say that when a fire breaks out in a condemned building, you do not run inside with a bucket of water. You stand across the street and let the structure consume itself. I reached into my leather tote bag and traced the outline of my smartphone. The device was powered down, the screen cold and dark. I had intentionally severed the digital tether. I knew exactly what was unfolding across the Atlantic. I knew the financial bomb had detonated in the middle of his grand celebration. And I knew the very first thing Nate would do when the panic set in. Back in the sprawling Cherry Creek mansion, Nate retreated into his mother's mahogany-paneled study, slamming the heavy door behind him. The muffled sounds of the uneasy party drifted through the walls. He leaned against the heavy oak desk, gasping for air. His tailored suit felt like a straitjacket. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb sliding frantically across the screen. For a decade, I was the architect of his salvation. Whenever he overdrafted an account, missed a tax deadline, or bungled a real estate contract, I was the one who quietly fixed the math. I shielded him from the consequences of his own reckless behavior. He dialed my number, acting on pure, desperate muscle memory. He pressed the phone to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected the line to ring. He expected my calm, capable voice to answer, ready to absorb his mess and synthesize a solution. Instead, he was met with the cold, automated tone of a disconnected line. He pulled the phone away, staring at the screen in disbelief. He dialed again, jabbing his thumb against the glass. The same automated voice echoed in his ear. I was unreachable. I was a ghost. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was entirely isolated. There was no safety net. The brilliant, quiet woman he had mocked and discarded was no longer standing between him and the abyss. He fought viciously to claim the corporate debt, and now he had to carry it alone. He dropped the phone onto the desk, burying his face in his trembling hands. Outside the study, the engagement party was quietly dismantling itself. The string quartet had packed their instruments and slipped out the service entrance. The wealthy guests, sensing the toxic odor of impending bankruptcy, began making their swift, awkward exits. They did not say goodbye to Patricia. They murmured vague excuses about early morning tea times and lingering headaches as they hurried toward the valet stand. Patricia stood alone in the center of her grand living room, watching her carefully curated social standing evaporate. The catered food sat untouched on silver platters, the caviar growing warm under the chandelier light. Kelsey sat rigidly on a velvet sofa, staring at the spilled champagne staining her expensive shoes, her mind racing with 100 terrifying questions. The house, which had been buzzing with arrogant triumph just 20 minutes prior, was now a silent, echoing tomb. The trap had sprung, the jaws locking firmly in place, and Nate had engineered the entire mechanism himself. The silence in the house was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the avalanche that was about to hit them when the banks opened on Monday morning. That morning arrived in Denver with a sharp, unforgiving frost that coated the windshields of the expensive cars parked along Cherry Creek. Nate Collins woke up with a pounding headache and a dry, metallic taste in his mouth. He spent the entire Sunday avoiding phone calls, pacing the length of his empty house, convincing himself that the default notice was nothing more than an administrative oversight. He believed his own lies. He possessed an uncanny ability to twist reality to suit his ego, deciding that a few stern phone calls to his lenders would clear the air and restore his kingdom. He showered, dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, and strapped the heavy silver watch to his wrist. He needed to project strength. His first stop was an upscale artisanal coffee shop on his usual morning route. He ordered a complicated, overpriced espresso drink, leaning against the counter while projecting an aura of casual wealth. When the barista handed him the steaming cup, Nate pulled a sleek titanium credit card from his designer wallet and tapped it against the payment terminal. A sharp, negative beep cut through the ambient noise of the cafe. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. Nate chuckled, offering a dismissive wave of his hand. He told the young barista that the bank's security algorithms were always overly sensitive when he made large weekend purchases. He pulled a second card, a premium platinum account, and inserted the chip. The machine processed for 3 long seconds before emitting the exact same harsh, negative tone. Declined. The line of affluent customers behind him shifted restlessly. A low murmur of impatience swept through the queue. Nate felt a sudden searing heat rise in his cheeks. He avoided making eye contact with anyone, his charming facade fracturing under the weight of public humiliation. He dug into his pockets, hoping to find a stray $20 bill, but his wallet contained only plastic promises he could no longer keep. He pushed the expensive coffee back across the marble counter, muttering a strained excuse about a system outage, and walked briskly out the glass doors. The cold morning air hit his flushed face as he marched directly toward his leased luxury SUV. He drove straight to the primary branch of his financial institution, the tires of his vehicle squealing slightly as he pulled into a premium parking space. He marched through the towering glass doors of the bank, bypassing the teller line entirely, and demanded an immediate audience with the branch manager. The manager, a pragmatic man named Preston, who used to greet Nate with warm handshakes and golf invitations, now looked at him with an expression of guarded, professional pity. Preston ushered Nate into a small frosted glass office and closed the heavy door, sealing them in a quiet, sterile vacuum. Nate leaned across the desk, his voice tight and demanding. He ordered Preston to lift the hold on his personal accounts, claiming a ridiculous clerical error was freezing his assets. Preston did not smile. He opened a thick manila folder and turned a printed spreadsheet toward Nate. The banker folded his hands, his tone flat and unyielding. "There is no error," Preston explained. "When your commercial brokerage notes went into default last Friday, it triggered a standard cross-collateralization clause. The bank automatically enacted a blanket freeze on all your linked personal assets to secure the outstanding corporate debt. Your personal checking accounts, your savings, your liquid market portfolios, every single dollar you possess is now locked to offset the $3 million deficit. You have zero available liquidity." Nate stared at the black ink on the spreadsheet. The numbers blurred together. He argued that the corporate entity was a separate legal structure, shielded from his personal finances. Preston simply tapped a manicured finger against the printed liability assumption clause. The manager reminded him that by signing that specific waiver during his divorce settlement, Nate personally guaranteed the entirety of the toxic debt. The protective corporate veil was gone. The bank owned his present, and they owned his immediate future. Nate stumbled out of the bank branch the morning sun feeling harsh and blinding. He retreated into the leather interior of his vehicle, locking the doors. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. He pulled out his phone and dialed his high-priced divorce attorney. The phone rang twice before the lawyer answered, his tone brisk and impatient. Nate unleashed a torrent of desperate accusations, shouting that his ex-wife committed fraud. He demanded the attorney file an emergency injunction, claiming I manipulated the corporate ledgers and deceived the court. The lawyer let out a long, heavy sigh. He cut off the frantic rant with a sharp, undeniable dose of reality. She did not deceive anybody. The attorney stated, his voice stripped of any former reverence. During the final round of mediation, her legal team delivered a heavy, sealed box containing 400 pages of exhaustive financial disclosures. The documents detailed every single failing commercial lease, every defaulted loan, every negative balance carrying over in your brokerage firm. It was all printed in black and white. Nate opened his mouth to argue, but the lawyer continued, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. You laughed at the box, the attorney reminded him. You called it a stall tactic. I explicitly advised you to hire an independent auditor to review those files before finalizing the asset division. You told me you did not need an accountant to tell you how to run your own business. You demanded we speed up the signing so you could propose to your young girlfriend that same evening. You voluntarily signed a binding waiver acknowledging you refused to look at the math. Nate felt a cold, hollow sensation open up in the pit of his stomach. He asked the lawyer what their next legal move would be, grasping for a lifeline. The response was brutal and final. The attorney informed Nate that pursuing a frivolous fraud claim would require a $50,000 retainer, funds the lawyer knew Nate could no longer access. The call ended with the attorney formally withdrawing his representation, the line clicking dead in Nate's ear. While the architect of his own destruction sat paralyzed in a frozen Denver parking lot, I was navigating the polished corridors of a centuries-old financial institution in the heart of Rome. The air inside the private wealth management office smelled of aged leather and rich espresso. I sat across a sprawling walnut desk from Matteo, a senior Italian asset director who appreciated precision as much as I did. We were finalizing the last structural pillars of a fortress I began building months ago. My tactical brilliance was never about hiding money in the shadows. Hiding money leaves a trail of breadcrumbs for aggressive lawyers to follow. True logistical mastery involves moving assets right out in the open, using the blinding glare of the law to your advantage. Weeks before I ever filed the initial divorce petition, I triggered a dormant clause in our decade-old prenuptial agreement. When Nate and I first married, he insisted on a rigid contract to protect his future commissions, assuming he would always be the primary breadwinner. That same document contained a reciprocal stipulation, allowing either party to separate their individual corporate bonuses into independent holding accounts. I executed that clause perfectly. I funneled my substantial global logistics bonuses through legitimate domestic channels, paid every requisite tax, and then wired the remaining liquid capital into a foreign jurisdiction. Matteo slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the walnut desk. The documents inside confirm the successful establishment of an irrevocable European trust, naming Leo and Mia as the sole beneficiaries. The trust was governed entirely by strict Italian privacy and inheritance laws. Because the capital was generated by my individual performance bonuses and the revenue of the inherited Tuscan villa, the funds were legally classified as separate, non-marital property before the divorce even began. I signed the final signature lines with a smooth, steady hand. The wealth was locked inside a vault that no United States court possessed the jurisdiction to breach. Nate could hire 100 aggressive attorneys, and they would only hit a reinforced concrete wall of international red tape. I stood up, shaking Matteo's hand. I walked out into the vibrant, sun-drenched streets of the ancient city, feeling a profound sense of lightness. My children were secure, their futures insulated from the chaotic, narcissistic storm their father created. Back in the quiet isolation of his luxury SUV, The gravity of the situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of Nate's ego. He dropped his phone onto the passenger seat. He stared blankly through the windshield at the bustling Denver traffic. The terrifying realization settled into his bones. His ex-wife did not simply surrender in that sleek mediation room. She executed a flawless, surgical, financial assassination. She handed him the exact weapon he demanded and watched patiently while he pointed it directly at himself. His breathing grew shallow. A new, far more devastating thought pierced through his spiraling panic. The freezing of his personal accounts was only the first wave of the avalanche. His mind raced back to a transaction he orchestrated 2 years prior, a quiet agreement he pushed through when his commercial real estate firm needed a quick injection of capital. He needed collateral to secure that initial loan, collateral the bank could physically claim if the business ever went under. He did not use his own home. He convinced someone else to assume the risk. He turned the key in the ignition, his hands slick with cold sweat, realizing the bank was already drafting the paperwork to seize his mother's house. Tuesday morning cast a pale, unforgiving light across the manicured lawns of Cherry Creek. Patricia Collins sat in her glass-enclosed sunroom, staring at a porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea that had long since gone cold. The day following a grand social event was typically reserved for fielding phone calls from envious neighbors, trading subtle compliments, and securing her position at the apex of Denver high society. Today, her phone sat silent on the glass table. The abrupt, awkward end to the engagement party still hung in the air like smoke. She tried to convince herself that her son's strange behavior the previous night was merely a temporary bout of exhaustion. She smoothed the lapels of her cashmere robe, determined to maintain her dignified routine. Her sprawling brick estate was her armor. Her late husband had purchased the home during a market dip 3 decades ago, and Patricia spent every subsequent year treating the property as a royal court. The sweeping oak staircase, the imported Persian rugs, the vaulted ceilings, they all projected an aura of generational prosperity that masked her very ordinary bank accounts. The house was her entire identity. A sharp, rhythmic knock echoed through the grand foyer, breaking the morning stillness. It was not the melodic chime of the brass doorbell. It was a firm, heavy rapping against the solid wood. Patricia frowned, tightening the belt of her robe. She walked past the formal dining room, annoyed by the unannounced disruption. She pulled open the heavy front door, expecting a confused delivery driver or a persistent landscaper. Nobody stood on the expansive slate porch. The quiet suburban street was empty. Patricia looked down and found a thick, neon yellow document secured to the center of her varnished door with heavy industrial tape. She gasped, offended by the crude adhesive damaging the expensive wood finish. She ripped the paper down, intending to call the Homeowners Association to complain about the vandalism. Then her eyes focused on the bold black text printed across the top of the page. Notice of intent to foreclose and seize collateral. The crisp autumn air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Patricia stared at the official county seal stamped at the bottom of the page, her mind struggling to process the clinical, terrifying legal jargon. The document outlined a commercial lending default originating from Nate's brokerage firm. The numbers printed on the page were staggering, climbing well past $3 million. But the most devastating paragraph was located near the signature line. The bank was legally executing its right to claim the physical property listed as the primary collateral for the defaulted loan. The address listed was her own. 2 years ago, Nate had orchestrated a quiet visit to this very house. He arrived wearing a charming smile and carrying a bottle of vintage wine. He sat in her sunroom and explained that his commercial real estate firm was on the verge of acquiring a highly lucrative downtown lot. He spun a brilliant, intoxicating story about doubling their family legacy. He just needed a short-term bridge loan to finalize the paperwork. He told his mother that the bank required a physical asset to secure the funds, assuring her it was merely a bureaucratic formality. He promised the lender would never touch her home, claiming the new downtown development would generate enough revenue to pay off the loan within 6 months. Patricia, blinded by her desperate need to view her son as a financial genius, signed the guarantor paperwork without consulting a single attorney. She believed the glossy narrative he sold her. She never bothered to ask why Clara, his competent and organized wife, had refused to sign the same documents. Now the toxic reality of that signature was taped to her front door. The bridge loan was never paid. The downtown lot was a failure. The bank was coming for her sanctuary. Her knees buckled slightly, forcing her to lean against the doorframe for support. The sheer humiliation of the neon paper burned in her chest. The process server had walked right up to her porch in broad daylight, leaving a bright yellow beacon of financial ruin for all her wealthy neighbors to see. She scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut. She grabbed her phone from the sunroom table, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she dialed her son's number. Nate answered on the fourth ring. He was still sitting in the driver's seat of his leased SUV, trapped in the parking lot outside his frozen bank branch. "A man came to my house," Patricia stammered, her polished country club veneer cracking into jagged shards. "He taped a foreclosure warning to my door. Nathaniel, the letter says the bank is taking the estate. It says you defaulted on the commercial note." Nate squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the phone hard against his ear. The panic in his mother's voice was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. "Mom, just listen to me," he pleaded, his voice tight and frantic. "Do not panic. It is a mistake. I am fixing it right now. Clara set me up. She manipulated the corporate ledgers during the divorce. She hid the debt and tricked the mediator. My lawyers are filing an injunction today to reverse the asset division." Patricia listened to his rapid, breathless excuses. For 30 years she had nurtured his fragile ego, defending his poor choices and blaming the world for his mistakes. But the neon paper sitting on her glass table was an undeniable mathematical fact. She thought about Clara. She thought about the quiet, fiercely intelligent woman she had spent a decade mocking. Clara never scrambled. Clara never raised her voice to cover a lie. Clara managed global supply chains with ruthless efficiency. A chilling realization washed over the matriarch. If Clara had truly manipulated the books to hide the debt, why did Nate demand sole ownership of the company during the divorce? Why did he fight so hard to claim a business he now claimed was a trap? He did not fight for a trap. He fought for an empire, entirely unaware that the empire was already bankrupt. "You lied to me," Patricia whispered, the truth settling into her bones like frost. "You told me the collateral was a formality. You used my home to fund a failing business, and you lost it." "Clara did not manipulate anything. You signed the papers because you were too arrogant to read them." Nate tried to interrupt, his voice rising in desperate denial, but Patricia let the phone drop from her ear. She ended the call, the screen going dark. The cruel woman who had cornered Clara at the country club, who had proudly celebrated the dismissal of her own grandchildren, finally understood the lethal cost of her vanity. Her golden boy was the architect of her destruction, and she had handed him the blueprints. While the Collins family crumbled under the weight of their own deceit in Colorado, the morning sun was bathing the ancient streets of Rome in a warm, golden glow. I walked hand in hand with Leo and Mia through the grand iron gates of the St. Stephen's International Academy. The campus was a breathtaking blend of modern educational facilities and historic stone architecture, nestled safely within the vibrant heart of the city. The air here buzzed with the bright, energetic chatter of children speaking Italian, French, and English. We stepped into the headmaster's office, a spacious room lined with rich wooden bookshelves and flooded with natural light. The headmaster, a dignified man named Rossi, greeted us with a warm, genuine smile. He did not care about social pedigrees or country club gossip. He cared about character, intellect, and preparation. We sat across from his heavy oak desk as he reviewed the enrollment documents. "Everything is perfectly in order, Mrs. Spencer," he said, his tone carrying a deep respect. I slid a sleek, embossed confirmation folder across the desk. It contained the receipts for the international wire transfers I authorized that morning. Utilizing the funds from my separate, untouchable European trust, I had paid the academic tuition for both of my children in full for the next 5 years. Their education was permanently secured. Their daily environment was safe, enriching, and entirely insulated from the toxic narcissism that defined their father's household. Rossi shook my hand, welcoming Leo and Mia to the academy. I watched my children follow a smiling faculty member out into the sunlit courtyard, their faces radiant with excitement for their new adventure. I felt a profound, quiet victory settle in my chest. The juxtaposition was striking. Patricia Collins was sitting in a hollow, unpaid mansion, waiting for the bank to lock her out. Nate was suffocating in a parked car, his assets frozen and his reputation destroyed. They gambled their lives on the illusion of power. I invested my life in the foundation of reality. Back in Denver, Nate sat in the heavy silence of his vehicle, staring blankly at the steering wheel. His mother had hung up on him. His lawyer had abandoned him. His bank accounts were locked down tight. He had no moves left to play on the board. He closed his eyes, wishing he could simply dissolve into the leather seat. Then the heavy passenger door of his SUV swung open, letting the cold Colorado wind rush into the cabin. Kelsey slid into the seat next to him. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a tight, expectant smile. She dropped a glossy, silver-embossed wedding brochure onto the center console. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the cover, her voice bright and unyielding. "I just spoke to the event coordinator in Amalfi," Kelsey announced, entirely oblivious to the financial crater expanding beneath them. "She needs the $50,000 venue deposit wired by noon today, or we lose our reservation for the rehearsal dinner. We need to go to the bank right now, Nate." Nate stared at the brochure, the crisp, expensive paper mocking his empty pockets. The walls were closing in fast, and a brand new front of the war had just opened right inside his car. The glossy silver brochure felt like a razor blade resting against Nate's thigh. Kelsey tapped her manicured nail against the heavy cardstock, waiting for him to put the leased SUV in drive and head toward the nearest bank branch. She demanded a $50,000 wire transfer to secure an oceanfront terrace in Amalfi. Her eyes were bright and focused entirely on the fantasy wedding she believed she had earned by securing a wealthy broker. She did not notice the beads of sweat forming along Nate's hairline. He gripped the leather steering wheel, his mind sprinting through a labyrinth of potential excuses. He forced a practiced and condescending chuckle. He reached over and gently closed the brochure, patronizing her with a soft smile. He told her the Italian venue was perfect, but the timing of the deposit was slightly complicated. He spun a highly technical lie, leaning heavily on his real estate vocabulary, to confuse her. He explained that Clara and her bitter legal team had triggered a standard post-divorce audit. He claimed his liquid capital was temporarily tied up in a mandatory escrow hold, framing it as a routine procedural delay that frequently happened during high net worth asset divisions. He promised the funds would clear by the end of the week, kissing the back of her hand to seal the deception. Kelsey frowned, her enthusiasm dampening, but she accepted the dense financial jargon. She pivoted her demands, requesting a smaller, immediate deposit to hold the luxury florist and the custom dress designer instead. She required $15,000 in cash by the end of the day. Nate agreed without hesitation, dropping her off at a high-end bridal salon downtown before driving his vehicle toward the only financial institution that would look at him. He parked his luxury vehicle outside a dilapidated strip mall on the industrial outskirts of Denver. The neon sign above the storefront flickered in the daylight, advertising instant cash and title loans. For his entire adult life, Nate had mocked the people who utilized these predatory businesses. He viewed financial struggle as a moral failing of the lower class. Now he walked through the smudged glass doors, breathing in the stale smell of cigarette smoke and cheap industrial floor cleaner. He sat across from a bored clerk, chewing peppermint gum. Nate slid the registration for his leased SUV across the scratched laminate counter. He was committing borderline fraud by leveraging a vehicle he did not own outright, but sheer desperation had overridden his legal logic. He signed a contract featuring a crippling triple-digit interest rate, pressing down hard with a cheap plastic pen chained to the desk. He traded the last shreds of his pride for a cashier check, buying himself a few more days of a fragile, crumbling illusion. Kelsey was not easily fooled for long. Before securing her engagement to Nate, she spent years studying the subtle, quiet indicators of authentic wealth. She knew the profound difference between temporary cash flow issues and systemic insolvency. The cracks in Nate's facade began to multiply, visible to a woman trained to hunt for financial stability. The first undeniable warning sign occurred on Thursday evening. Nate abruptly canceled their reservation at a Michelin star restaurant in the city center, claiming he was exhausted from navigating the corporate audit. He suggested ordering cheap takeout instead. Kelsey narrowed her eyes, watching him nervously check his phone every 3 minutes during dinner. The next morning, the illusion fractured further. They walked into an upscale Cherry Creek boutique to purchase a pair of designer shoes for her upcoming bridal shower. Nate handed his secondary credit card to the cashier with a confident flick of his wrist. The card machine buzzed a sharp, loud denial. Nate quickly snatched the plastic back, blaming a sensitive fraud alert trigger, his face flushing a deep crimson hue. He paid with the remaining remnants of his predatory loan cash, but Kelsey watched his hands shake visibly as he counted the paper bills. Authentic millionaires do not carry wads of sweaty cash to pay for footwear, and they do not sweat through their tailored shirts when a card declines. She remained silent during the tense ride back to the neighborhood, her mind assembling the puzzle pieces he was desperately trying to conceal. They arrived at the marital home Nate had fought so hard to strip away from me during the mediation. During our 12-year marriage, I managed the sprawling property with invisible and relentless efficiency. The hardwood floors were always polished to a high shine. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen island, and the mail was meticulously sorted into organized leather trays in the study. I infused the large structure with warmth, order, and life. Now the house was a barren, echoing show. Dust gathered thick on the imported credenzas. The expensive indoor plants I cultivated for years were withered and brown from neglect. A mountain of unopened red-stamped envelopes sat haphazardly on the granite countertops. The stainless steel refrigerator contained only bottled water and leftover takeout containers. Without my silent labor holding the pieces together, the estate felt like an abandoned museum. The physical emptiness of the living space mirrored the hollow reality of Nate's frozen bank accounts. Kelsey walked into the kitchen, the heels of her new shoes clicking sharply against the cold tile. She picked up the towering stack of unopened mail. Nate lunged forward, trying to snatch the envelopes from her hand, but he was too slow. She fended him off and read the return addresses aloud. Final notice from the utility company. Delinquent tax alerts from the county. Foreclosure warnings from a secondary lender. She slammed the stack of letters onto the granite counter, the sharp sound echoing off the bare walls. She spun around to face him, her features twisted with raw indignation. She demanded the truth immediately. She asked him why a man boasting about a multi-million-dollar commercial brokerage was receiving shut-off notices for his electricity. Nate backed away, raising his hands in a defensive posture. He fell back on his usual cowardly strategy, attempting to deflect the blame onto me. He insisted Clara was sabotaging his credit, tying up his resources in frivolous litigation just to ruin their engagement. He begged her to be patient, promising the imaginary escrow hold would lift in a matter of days and restore their wealthy lifestyle. Kelsey did not buy the performance. She stepped closer, her voice slicing through the empty kitchen like a surgical scalpel. She told him she did not waste her youth to become the wife of a bankrupt fraud. She screamed that she had friends flying in from across the country for a luxury destination wedding, and she refused to be publicly humiliated by a man who could not even keep his lights on. She picked up the glossy Amalfi Coast brochure from the counter and threw it directly at his chest. The heavy paper hit his designer shirt and fluttered uselessly to the floor. She delivered a final, unyielding ultimatum. She told him he had until Friday afternoon to produce the $50,000 wire transfer for the Italian venue. If the money did not materialize in the account, the engagement was permanently over, and she would pack her bags and leave him in the dust. She turned on her heel and marched upstairs, the bedroom door slamming shut with definitive finality. Nate stood alone in the cold, dusty kitchen. The silence pressed heavily against his eardrums. He was trapped inside a tightening vice. On one side, a ruthless commercial bank was actively seizing every single asset tied to his name. On the other side, a mistress who only loved his wallet was counting down the hours until she abandoned him to the wreckage. The payday loan cash was gone. His credit was destroyed. He looked around the hollow house, realizing he had 0 moves left to play on the financial board. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of darkness. If he could not access his own money, he needed to force his ex-wife to open her untouchable European vault. He could not sue me for the Italian villa directly, but he knew I would pay any price to protect the only things I truly valued. He walked toward his dark study, a new and sinister strategy forming in his frantic mind. The financial war was lost, but he decided it was time to cross a line he could never uncross. He decided to use his own children as leverage. Desperation is a cold, calculating instructor. Sitting in the dusty, neglected study of the Cherry Creek house, Nate collated his dwindling options. The walls of his false empire were shrinking by the hour. His bank accounts remained frozen. His credit score was a smoking crater. His new fiancée was upstairs packing her designer luggage and threatening to walk out the front door unless a $50,000 wire transfer magically materialized by Friday afternoon. He needed liquid capital to survive the week, and the only person holding a functioning checkbook was sitting an ocean away. He knew he possessed 0 legal authority to breach my Italian trust directly. The European privacy laws were an impenetrable fortress. But desperate men do not look for legal loopholes. They look for emotional vulnerabilities. Nate decided to weaponize the only remaining connection we shared. He decided to attack me using our children. He grabbed his keys and drove his leased SUV to a dilapidated strip mall on the edge of town, far away from the polished high-rises of his former corporate life. He parked outside a cramped legal office that advertised quick divorces and discount litigation in faded window decals. He walked inside, utilizing the last few $100s of his predatory loan cash to hire a lawyer whose primary qualification was a willingness to overlook perjury for a flat fee. Nate sat across a battered metal desk and spun a horrific, fabricated narrative. He played the role of the terrified, victimized father to perfection. He claimed I had fled the jurisdiction without his knowledge or consent. He accused me of international parental kidnapping, instructing the discount attorney to file an ex parte emergency petition in the Colorado Family Court. His goal was simple, transparent, and exceptionally cruel. He wanted a sympathetic judge to issue a repatriation order, forcing law enforcement to mandate my immediate return to the United States. He believed that if he could drag me back into a Denver mediation room, he could use the threat of a bitter, prolonged custody war to extort a substantial spousal support settlement. He viewed Leo and Mia not as flesh and blood, but as poker chips, ready to slide them across the table to cover his mounting gambling debts. He signed the fraudulent affidavit, his signature sealing a lie he hoped would save his lifestyle. The notification arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon in Rome. The Tuscan sun was casting long, elegant shadows across the stone courtyard of the villa. I was sitting at a rustic wooden table, reviewing a linen supply contract for the boutique hotel, enjoying the profound silence of my new life. My phone vibrated against the table, shattering the peace. The caller ID displayed the name of my Denver attorney, Morgan. I answered the call, anticipating a routine administrative update regarding the final property deed transfers. Instead, Morgan bypassed the customary greetings and read Nate's emergency filing aloud. For 10 agonizing seconds, the calm corporate exterior I had spent years perfecting fractured. A primal, suffocating terror gripped my chest tight and unyielding. My breath hitched in my throat. The thought of a courtroom forcing my children back into that toxic, unstable environment was a nightmare taking physical shape. I envisioned police escorts, confiscated passports, and my children crying as they were handed back to a man who only wanted to use them as financial leverage. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping harshly against the stone patio. I told Morgan to book the next available commercial flight out of Leonardo da Vinci Airport. I was ready to fly back to Colorado and fight him in the streets if necessary. Morgan heard the raw panic in my voice. She did not coddle me. She utilized her sharp, grounding tone to stop my downward spiral. "Clara," she commanded, her voice cutting through the static of the international line, "sit down and breathe. You are not booking a flight. You are not going back to Colorado. He is firing blank ammunition and he is about to shoot himself in the foot. Let me remind you exactly what we buried in the final settlement packet." I forced myself to sit back down, my pulse pounding in my ears, listening closely as Morgan outlined the tactical safety net we installed months ago. During the frantic final days of our divorce mediation, Nate was singularly focused on securing the commercial brokerage and the Cherry Creek real estate. He viewed the custody arrangement as a tedious administrative hurdle, keeping him from his victory lap with Kelsey. I leveraged his impatience perfectly. I drafted a highly specific, non-negotiable parenting plan. The document granted me sole physical custody and primary decision-making authority regarding their education, health care, and residence. Furthermore, it contained an explicit, undeniable relocation provision. The clause stated in clear, unambiguous language that I possessed the irrevocable right to relocate internationally with the minor children, requiring zero further consent or notification from the respondent. Nate never bothered to read the document. He viewed weekend visitations as a burden that would interfere with his new, glamorous lifestyle. He wanted the freedom to travel with his young mistress, attend luxury parties, and sleep late without the inconvenience of hiring babysitters or attending elementary school plays. He eagerly signed his name on the dotted line, legally surrendering his daily parental rights in exchange for uninterrupted time with Kelsey. He signed the permission slip for our European departure months before we ever packed a single suitcase. The emergency hearing convened the following morning in a downtown Denver courthouse. The courtroom was a sterile, imposing theater of polished oak and fluorescent lighting. Nate stood beside his discount lawyer, wearing his best tailored suit, projecting the image of a heartbroken, terrified father. He delivered a tearful, impassioned performance to the presiding judge. He claimed he woke up to find an empty house, asserting his beloved children were stolen in the dead of night. He pleaded for the court to issue an immediate repatriation order, demanding I return to American soil to face justice for tearing his family apart. Morgan did not match his theatrics. She dialed into the hearing via a secure video link, her expression unbothered and intensely professional. She waited patiently for Nate to finish his monologue. When the judge asked for her response, Morgan simply directed the court's attention to the certified exhibits she filed an hour prior. She asked the judge to review the final divorce decree, specifically pointing to page 18, subsection C. The judge, a stern veteran of the family court system with zero tolerance for perjury, adjusted her reading glasses. She read the highlighted text in silence. The heavy atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. The judge looked down from the high bench, her expression hardening into pure, unfiltered disdain. She fixed her gaze on Nate and asked him if the signature at the bottom of the page belonged to him. Nate stammered, the color draining rapidly from his face. He looked at his discount lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in the blank notepad on his desk. Nate tried to backtrack, arguing that he was coerced, that he did not understand the dense legal jargon, that he assumed the clause only permitted simple, out-of-state vacations. He whined that the wording was deceptive. The judge slammed her wooden gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the silent room, cutting off his pathetic excuses. She stated clearly, for the official record, that ignorance of a signed contract is not a valid legal defense in her courtroom. She noted that Nate explicitly waived his right to a prolonged custody evaluation, choosing instead to expedite the process for his own convenience. The ruling was swift and unforgiving. The judge dismissed the emergency motion with prejudice, meaning it could never be filed or argued again. But the consequences did not end there. The family court system heavily penalizes individuals who weaponize the judicial docket for financial extortion. Recognizing the filing as a blatant bad faith manipulation tactic, the judge issued severe financial sanctions against Nathaniel Collins. She ordered him to pay all of my legal fees associated with the hearing, plus a punitive fine for wasting the court's time. A penalty of $9,000 was immediately added to his towering mountain of liabilities, payable directly to Morgan's law firm. Nate walked out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors sealing his fate behind him. The crisp Colorado air offered no comfort. He stood on the concrete steps of the courthouse, digesting the sheer magnitude of his miscalculation. He had tried to use his children as hostages to fund his failing lifestyle. Instead, the legal system had just confirmed that he had legally, permanently signed them away. He traded Leo and Mia for a young mistress who was currently packing her bags and a commercial brokerage that was actively bankrupting him. He pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at the blank screen. He had no legal recourse to reach my European assets. He had no parental authority to demand my return. He was stranded on an island of his own making, watching the dark water rise over his shoes. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, I poured a glass of crisp local wine and watched the Tuscan sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of violet and gold. Leo and Mia were laughing in the courtyard, chasing a stray butterfly through the olive trees. The brief moment of terror had passed, replaced by an unbreakable, documented peace. The financial and legal walls were closing in on Nathaniel Collins, and his final, desperate attempt to break free had only tightened the lock on his cage. The afternoon sun baked the ancient stones of the Colosseum, casting long shadows across the gladiator arena. I stood on the upper tier with Leo and Mia, watching them point at the sprawling ruins below. My children were fascinated by the history of emperors and battles, their imaginations running wild in the heart of Rome. For them, it was an exciting field trip. For me, the enduring architecture offered a profound parallel. The Romans understood how to build fortresses designed to withstand centuries of relentless siege. They utilized precise engineering, unbreakable foundations, and calculated foresight. I had applied those exact same principles to my financial life. While the ruins around us were slowly reclaimed by time, the legal fortress I constructed around my family remained entirely unbreachable. Back in Colorado, Nathaniel Collins was discovering just how impenetrable that fortress truly was. The family court judge had slammed the door on his desperate custody stunt, leaving him bruised and heavily sanctioned. His bank accounts were still frozen by the commercial lender. His mother was facing eviction. His new fiancée was counting down the hours until her Italian wedding deposit was due. Nate was backed into a corner, suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. But arrogant men rarely possess the capacity for self-reflection. Instead of accepting defeat, he convinced himself that a larger, more hostile weapon would turn the tide of the war. He decided to launch a civil lawsuit. Nate formulated a theory that I had deliberately undervalued the Tuscan villa during our mediation sessions. He convinced himself that the boutique hotel was hiding millions in unreported equity. He believed that if he could expose this perceived fraud in a civil courtroom, a judge would tear up the original divorce decree and award him half of the European estate. He needed a legal bulldog to execute the plan. He scoured Denver for the most ruthless, expensive civil litigator he could find. He secured a meeting with a high-profile attorney named Vance, a man known for tearing apart corporate contracts and terrifying opposing counsel. Hiring Vance required a substantial upfront retainer. Nate possessed zero liquid capital, so he liquidated the only remaining asset he had left. He gathered his vintage luxury watch collection, the timepieces he used to flaunt at dinner parties, and drove to a pawnbroker on the edge of the city. He sold the collection for a fraction of its true value, carrying the humiliating stack of paper bills directly into the lawyer's high-rise office. Nate sat across from the imposing mahogany desk and spun his web of accusations. He painted me as a manipulative mastermind who swindled a devoted husband out of a fortune. He demanded that Vance file an immediate injunction to freeze the Italian property issue subpoenas for my European bank records and drag me back to American soil for a grueling deposition. Nate leaned back in the plush leather chair, confident that his intimidation tactics would force a lucrative settlement. He thought loud threats always won the day. Vance collected the cash retainer and promised to initiate a comprehensive forensic investigation. The attorney deployed his team of paralegals and international financial experts to dissect the footprint of the Tuscan estate. Nate spent the next 3 days floating on a cloud of vindictive anticipation. He pictured me receiving a terrifying summons. He imagined himself walking away with a multi-million-dollar payout, enough to clear the commercial debt and secure Kelsey's extravagant wedding. On Thursday morning, Vance summoned Nate back to the downtown firm. Nate arrived wearing his best tailored suit, expecting to review the finalized lawsuit. He walked into the corner office wearing a smug, victorious grin. But the atmosphere inside the room was distinctly cold. Vance did not offer a celebratory handshake. The attorney sat behind his desk, sliding a thin manila folder across the polished wood. Nate opened the folder, expecting to find a drafted complaint. Instead, he found a single, brief memorandum summarizing the structural reality of my inheritance. Vance looked at his client with a mixture of professional exhaustion and mild disgust. The lawyer explained the concept of a jurisdiction trap. He told Nate that filing a lawsuit required a viable legal foundation, and the proposed case possessed none. The villa was bequeathed to me prior to our marriage. According to established Colorado law, inherited property remains separate and untouchable unless the owner makes the fatal mistake of commingling those assets with marital funds. If I had ever used a joint checking account to pay for a roof repair in Tuscany, or if I had ever transferred European rental income to pay the Denver mortgage, the property would have lost its protected status. But I spent 12 years working in global logistics. My entire career revolved around isolating variables and maintaining pristine operational boundaries. I treated my inheritance with the exact same rigorous discipline. Every single euro generated by the boutique hotel stayed within the borders of the European Union. The revenue flowed directly into an irrevocable trust governed strictly by Italian law. The maintenance costs, the staff salaries, and the property taxes were all paid from localized accounts. Not 1 cent ever crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Not one transaction ever touched an American ledger. Vance leaned forward, intertwining his fingers. He delivered the fatal blow with clinical precision. The lawyer informed Nate that the United States judicial system holds zero authority over a foreign real estate asset held in a foreign, irrevocable trust that was never commingled with domestic funds. No judge in Colorado possessed the jurisdictional power to subpoena the Italian banking records, let alone issue a freeze on the property. Nate stared at the lawyer, his jaw tightening. He argued that they were married for over a decade, insisting that he was entitled to a portion of the appreciation value. He demanded Vance file the paperwork anyway, hoping the sheer threat of a lawsuit would intimidate me into paying a settlement. Vance shook his head, refusing to entertain the delusion. The attorney stated that filing a baseless claim outside their jurisdiction would immediately result in dismissal and severe judicial sanctions for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. He reminded Nate that he was already penalized by the family court earlier that week. Another sanction would trigger an investigation by the State Bar Association. The case was dead on arrival. Nate felt the room spin. The grand strategy he banked his survival on was entirely useless. He realized that his loud bullying tactics were ineffective against my quiet, documented preparation. Paper beats volume every single time. I did not need to raise my voice or hire an expensive litigator to defend myself. My protection was already woven into the undeniable mathematics of international banking law. Vance stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. He handed Nate a final itemized invoice. The document detailed the countless billable hours the legal team spent researching the foreign trust and untangling the international statutes. The total cost of the investigation was $15,000. The retainer Nate funded by pawning his prized watch collection was thoroughly consumed. He had liquidated his last remaining possession, just to be told he was permanently defeated. Nate walked out of the high-rise building, the heavy glass doors shutting behind him. The bustling city traffic moved around him, indifferent to his total collapse. He stood on the concrete sidewalk, holding the final invoice. His pockets were empty. His legal options were exhausted. The crushing realization settled heavily upon his shoulders. He could not outsmart me. He could not intimidate me. He could not reach me. While Nate stood paralyzed on a Denver street corner, I purchased a small replica of a gladiator helmet for Leo from a street vendor outside the Coliseum. Mia held my hand, enjoying a slice of warm focaccia bread. We walked through the vibrant piazzas, the sounds of accordion music filling the air. I was wholly unbothered by the frantic flailing of my former husband. I knew the legal mechanisms were functioning exactly as designed. The financial isolation was flawless, but the collateral damage surrounding Nate was about to reach a critical tipping point. He slowly walked back to his leased vehicle, dreading the inevitable return to the hollow shell of his marital home. He knew Kelsey was waiting there, counting down the minutes until her requested wire transfer deadline. He had no money, no leverage, and no more lies to tell. The professional facade he maintained for years was about to suffer its most devastating casualty yet, and the final pillar of his false empire was preparing to crumble. The drive back to Cherry Creek felt like a slow march toward the gallows. Nate gripped the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white against the dark leather trim. He was returning to a hollow shell of a home, carrying the bitter knowledge of his permanent legal defeat in the civil courts. He had zero settlement funds to appease his demanding young fiancée. He needed an immediate miracle. He prayed for a lucrative contract to magically materialize and save his sinking brokerage firm. Instead, his smartphone chimed with an incoming call from Donovan Pierce. Donovan was Kelsey's uncle on her mother's side of the family. He was a self-made industrial warehouse magnate who controlled the most lucrative commercial portfolio currently listed under Nate's brokerage firm. Snagging the Pierce account was the crown jewel of Nate's entire career, a professional victory he paraded in front of his jealous peers for several years. In reality, Donovan only awarded the contract to the firm as a personal favor to his niece, hoping to ensure her future husband possessed a stable, reliable income stream. Donovan did not tolerate fiscal instability. He built his logistics empire by obsessively monitoring institutional risk and severing ties at the very first sign of corporate rot. Nate cleared his throat, forcing a cheerful and confident tone into his vocal register before answering the call. He greeted the older businessman with feigned enthusiasm, asking about an upcoming warehouse acquisition they had been discussing the previous month. He hoped to secure a large commission advance to cover the Italian wedding deposit required by Friday. The response on the other end of the cellular line was devoid of any familial warmth. Donovan did not return the polite pleasantries. His voice was a flat, icy current that froze the remaining blood pumping through Nate's veins. Donovan informed Nate that his chief financial officer ran a routine quarterly vendor risk assessment that very morning. The institutional auditing software triggered a catastrophic alert across their systems. The corporate background check flagged the $3 million default notice issued by Nate's primary commercial lender. The algorithm also exposed the cross-collateralization freeze on his personal checking accounts. The industrial magnate possessed a comprehensive, undeniable digital printout of Nate's total insolvency. Nate scrambled to assemble a defense mechanism. He recited the same exhausted lies he fed to his mother and his fiancée earlier in the week. He blamed the messy divorce proceedings. He blamed vindictive auditors trying to ruin his reputation. He promised the issue was a temporary clerical delay that would be resolved by the weekend. Donovan cut him off mid-sentence, his tone dripping with profound disgust. The older man stated that he did not care about the divorce or the petty domestic excuses. He cared about liability exposure. A broker who cannot manage his own ledgers is a radioactive risk to a supply chain. Donovan formally terminated their professional relationship on the spot, revoking Nate's access to the entire industrial portfolio. This decisive action effectively drove a final, lethal stake through the heart of the brokerage firm. Before Nate could formulate a desperate apology, the call disconnected. The dial tone echoed in the silent cabin of the luxury SUV. The loss of the Pierce account meant the firm was generating zero revenue to offset the loans. His business was officially dead in the water. Miles away, sitting in the barren kitchen of the Cherry Creek estate, Kelsey was staring at the digital clock displayed on her phone screen. The deadline for her Amalfi Coast wire transfer was rapidly approaching. Her phone rang loudly. She saw her uncle's name flashing on the screen and answered quickly, hoping he was calling to congratulate her on finalizing the beautiful venue. Instead, Donovan delivered a blunt, unvarnished financial autopsy of her groom. Her uncle did not soften the heavy blow. He detailed the frozen bank accounts, the defaulted commercial loans, and the impending real estate foreclosures. He explained that her wealthy partner was a mirage, a man drowning in a toxic ocean of commercial debt. Donovan warned his niece that tethering her youth to a bankrupt fraud would permanently ruin her own financial trajectory for decades. He advised her to leave the property immediately before the banks sent the liquidation teams to seize the remaining assets. Kelsey lowered the phone, the screen going dark. The lingering illusions she harbored about her glamorous future evaporated into thin air. The declined credit cards at the boutique, the canceled high-end dinners, the frantic pacing in the hallways, the pieces locked into a devastating and clear picture. She was not marrying a visionary real estate broker. She was attaching herself to a sinking ship. A fierce, self-preserving anger ignited deep within her chest. She sprinted up the sweeping oak staircase, her heels digging into the expensive carpet runner. She dragged 3 large designer suitcases from the walk-in closet and threw them onto the unmade mattress. She did not fold her garments. She frantically tossed silk dresses, expensive cosmetics, and imported shoes into the luggage, determined to escape the suffocating estate before the walls caved in around her. The house, stripped of the warmth and meticulous order I used to provide daily, felt like a cold, decaying tomb. The silence of the empty rooms amplified her rising panic. Nate turned his vehicle onto his suburban street, his mind numb from the relentless sequence of legal and professional defeats. As he pulled into the long concrete driveway, he saw the front door of the mansion propped wide open. Kelsey was struggling to drag her heavy luggage down the front porch steps. She was hauling the bags toward her own compact car, her face flushed with physical exertion and unadulterated rage. Nate threw the SUV into park and jumped out, leaving the engine running in the driveway. He ran toward her, his hands raised in a placating, desperate gesture. He called her name, begging her to stop, pleading for 5 minutes to explain the complicated situation. Kelsey dropped the handle of her heavy suitcase. The bag hit the pavement with a dull thud. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a potent mixture of betrayal and raw contempt. She did not wait for his fabricated excuses. She unleashed a torrent of verbal fury, her voice ringing out across the manicured lawns of the quiet neighborhood. She recounted the phone call with her uncle. She exposed the stark truth about his frozen bank accounts and his defaulted commercial loans. She screamed that he was a pathetic imposter who manipulated her into sacrificing her youth for a fantasy that never existed in reality. She told him he was a failure who wore expensive tailored suits to hide his profound incompetence from the world. Nate stepped backward, the venom in her harsh words striking him like physical blows to the chest. He tried to reach for her hand, whispering that they could start over somewhere new, that their love was more important than the lost money. The shallow sentiment only fueled her intense rage. Kelsey scoffed, a bitter, mocking sound that stripped away the last remaining shreds of his dignity. She informed him she had zero interest in living in poverty just to subsidize a man's shattered ego. She looked down at her left hand. The large diamond engagement ring caught the bright afternoon sunlight. The stone was a flawless, radiant cut, a symbol of the opulence he promised her. It was also a piece of jewelry he purchased using a high-interest predatory line of credit that was currently in severe default. Kelsey curled her fingers, sliding the cold metal over her knuckle. She held the ring between her thumb and index finger, staring at the man who had promised her the entire world. "You are nothing," she hissed, her tone cold and definitive. She threw the heavy ring directly at his chest. The jewelry struck his tailored lapel and dropped to the concrete driveway, bouncing once before settling into the dark groove of an expansion joint. Kelsey turned around, lifted her final suitcase into the trunk of her car, and slammed the lid shut. She climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. She did not look at him through the rearview mirror. She shifted into reverse, backed smoothly out of the driveway, and drove away, leaving a trail of warm exhaust in the crisp afternoon air. Nate stood alone on the pavement. The silence of the affluent neighborhood rushed back in heavy and oppressive. He looked down at the discarded diamond resting in the dirt. He slowly turned his head to look at the sprawling brick mansion he had fought so viciously to win during the divorce mediation rounds. A representative from his secondary mortgage lender had visited the property while he was meeting with the civil lawyer downtown. A thick official notice was firmly taped to the glass pane of the front door. The document declared the estate was officially entering pre-foreclosure proceedings. The bank was initiating the legal process to seize the primary residence due to non-payment. The pristine Denver kingdom he tried to steal was systematically dismantling itself. He possessed no clients to generate income. He had no partner to offer comfort. The influential mother who used to shield his mistakes was currently drowning in her own collateral debt. His children were thousands of miles away, safe and unreachable in a foreign jurisdiction. I had built a self-sustaining, untouchable sanctuary across the ocean, while he was left standing alone in a barren driveway, holding the hollow remains of a life built entirely on lies. The financial isolation was thorough, but the final, devastating eviction of the family legacy was only just beginning. The final blow to Patricia Collins did not arrive with the dramatic courtroom gavel. It arrived via certified mail on a brisk Wednesday morning. She sat in her formal dining room, tracing the rim of a bone china teacup, trying to ignore the mounting stack of past due notices cluttering the expansive mahogany table. The grand Cherry Creek estate, a property she treated as her sovereign territory for 3 decades, felt unusually drafty. The doorbell chimed, a polite, unassuming sound that masked the devastation waiting on the front porch. Patricia tightened the silk belt of her robe and walked to the entryway. A uniformed postal worker handed her a stiff legal envelope requiring her signature. She scribbled her name, her hand shaking slightly, and closed the heavy oak door. Tearing open the thick paper, her eyes fell upon a stark, unambiguous heading: Writ of Possession, 30-day notice to vacate. The commercial lender holding her son's defaulted business note had finalized the seizure of her home. The collateral clause Nate so casually dismissed was now a binding execution order. Her sanctuary, the sprawling brick mansion where she hosted charity galas and judged the less fortunate, no longer belonged to her. The bank demanded she surrender the premises by the end of the month, or local sheriffs would forcefully remove her possessions. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering to the imported Persian rug. The pristine illusion of generational prosperity she spent a lifetime defending was officially dead. 2 weeks later, the grand living room resembled a chaotic warehouse. The opulent furniture was either sold to cover immediate living expenses or draped in cheap moving blankets. The custom velvet drapery she adored was stripped from the tall windows, letting harsh daylight expose the fading paint on the walls. Patricia stood amidst a sea of brown, corrugated cardboard, packing her life away into identical, taped squares. Every item she wrapped in newspaper felt like a physical admission of failure. She held a heavy silver serving tray, a centerpiece from countless dinner parties, where she proudly mocked my dedication to global supply chain management. Now, the bitter irony burned in her throat. She realized my silent, efficient labor managing the family finances was the only barrier keeping the wolves away from her door. Without my steady income patching Nate's reckless deficits, the Collins dynasty collapsed in record time. Desperation forced Patricia to swallow her remaining pride. She picked up her smartphone and scrolled through her extensive contacts list, searching for a lifeline among the Denver high society elite. She dialed the number of Lillian Kensington, the reigning president of the Oak Ridge Country Club Ladies Auxiliary, a woman who previously treated Patricia like royalty during their joint charity fundraisers. The call connected, and Patricia adopted her most charming, resilient tone. She explained she was downsizing due to some unfortunate temporary legal misunderstandings. She gently inquired if Lillian might offer a guest house or a spare wing for a few months while the dust settled. The response on the other end of the line was breathtakingly cold. Lillian did not offer sympathy. She offered a stiff, rehearsed apology claiming her property was currently undergoing extensive renovations and simply could not accommodate guests. The rejection was swift and transparent. In their ruthless social circle, poverty was treated as a highly contagious disease. The affluent women who eagerly consumed Patricia's cruel gossip regarding my divorce were now sprinting in the opposite direction, terrified the financial ruin might tarnish their own pristine reputations. Lillian abruptly ended the conversation, citing a fictitious luncheon appointment. Patricia lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen. The wealthy peers she courted for 30 years vanished the instant her bank accounts dried up. Her social standing was a fragile mirage, sustained entirely by the very woman she chased away. The final day of the month brought a biting gray drizzle to the Colorado foothills. There were no professional movers hired to carefully transport the remaining boxes. Nate pulled a battered, rented box truck into the circular driveway. The sleek luxury SUV he drove just weeks prior was repossessed by the dealership in the dead of night. He stepped out of the rusted cab wearing faded denim and a wrinkled sweater, looking 10 years older than his actual age. His posture was defeated, his trademark arrogance replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. He lost his commercial real estate license pending an ethics investigation regarding his fraudulent loan applications. He was officially bankrupt, unemployed, and entirely stripped of his false identity. Mother and son worked in grim silence, loading the heavy cardboard boxes into the back of the rented truck. Nate avoided making eye contact with her, unable to face the devastating reality he had orchestrated. They left the grand Cherry Creek estate without a single backward glance, driving toward the industrial outskirts of the city. Their new residence was a tiny, run-down two-bedroom apartment in a decaying suburban complex. The asphalt parking lot was cracked, littered with damp trash and dead autumn leaves. They carried their belongings up 3 flights of concrete stairs, their breathing labored in the thin mountain air, every step feeling like a descent into purgatory. Patricia unlocked the cheap, hollow-core door and stepped inside her new reality. The apartment smelled of stale cooking grease and harsh ammonia floor cleaner. The ceilings were low, covered in textured acoustic popcorn that was peeling in the dark corners. The cramped living space barely accommodated her remaining armchairs, forcing them to squeeze past the furniture just to reach the minuscule kitchen. The walls were paper-thin, transmitting the muffled arguments and blaring televisions of their neighbors. For a woman who spent decades hosting elegant garden parties and dictating neighborhood aesthetics, the confined, dingy environment was a psychological prison. The claustrophobia set in instantly. She sat on the edge of a stained sofa, pulling her cashmere cardigan tight around her shoulders, shivering in the drafty room. Nate sat across from her at a scratched Formica dining table, staring blankly at the peeling linoleum floor. They were trapped together in a suffocating box of their own design, possessing no money, no prospects, and no one else to blame. 6,000 miles away, the Italian sky stretched wide and brilliant above the rolling hills of Tuscany. The Mediterranean sun warmed the ancient terracotta tiles of Villa Alba, casting a golden hue over the sprawling estate. I stood on the expansive stone balcony extending from my master suite, breathing in the crisp, clean air, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine and ripening olives. The horizon was vast, unbroken by smog or the stifling expectations of suburban America. The deep historical permanence of Rome offered a poetic contrast to the fragile, crumbling facade Nate and Patricia desperately clung to in Denver. My morning routine no longer involved deciphering cryptic credit card statements or managing the chaotic fallout of my former husband's reckless ego. I spent my days overseeing the boutique hotel operations, my logistics background ensuring the business functioned with seamless, profitable precision. I visited the local markets, selecting fresh basil and warm bread for the kitchens, entirely unburdened by the toxic superficiality of my previous existence. The estate was fully booked for the upcoming tourist season, the International Trust swelling with secure, localized revenue. Leo and Mia were thriving in their new environment. I could hear their bright, unfiltered laughter echoing from the infinity pool below, where they were splashing in the crystal-clear water under the watchful eye of our dedicated estate manager. They were free from the tension, the lies, and the cold vanity that poisoned their early childhood. The sound of distant church bells ringing across the valley underscored the profound peace settling over our family. I walked down the sweeping marble staircase, running my hand along the smooth, cool balustrade. The villa was spacious and breathing with life, every room infused with sunlight and purpose. I arranged a vase of fresh-cut sunflowers on the rustic wooden dining table, enjoying the quiet, domestic tranquility I earned through meticulous planning. I did not need to raise my voice to secure my sanctuary. I simply adhered to the undeniable rules of mathematics and legal preparation. The stark disparity between our two worlds was profound. The Collins family traded a fortune for a fleeting illusion, resulting in their confinement within a dark, decaying apartment. I traded a heavy, thankless burden for genuine independence, expanding my reality into a sunlit paradise. The financial and legal mechanisms I initiated were operating flawlessly, completing the precise separation of our lives. Yet the deep silence of my Italian retreat was destined to be interrupted one final time. The crushing weight of the rundown Denver apartment was driving Patricia toward an act of profound desperation. Bereft of her wealthy friends and confined with a broken son, the matriarch was running out of oxygen. She needed a lifeline, and her frantic mind was turning toward the only woman who ever successfully kept her afloat, preparing to make a phone call that would shatter her last remaining shred of dignity. The radiator tucked into the corner of the dingy living room hissed loudly, spitting rusty steam into the stagnant air of the suburban apartment. Patricia sat on a sagging thrift store sofa, wrapping a frayed knit blanket tightly around her shoulders to ward off the chill. The thin drywall offered zero insulation against the bitter Colorado wind or the loud arguments of the tenants next door. She stared at a yellow water stain spreading across the popcorn ceiling, tracing its jagged edges while her stomach cramped from hunger. The unreliable refrigerator held only a half-empty jar of generic mayonnaise and a carton of expired milk. Nate was asleep in the adjacent bedroom, having surrendered to a deep, lethargic depression. He spent his days staring at the bare paint, refusing to speak, his inflated ego shattered beyond repair. He offered no solutions, leaving his mother to navigate the crushing reality of their insolvency alone. Patricia picked up her mobile phone. The glass screen was cracked in the bottom corner, a fresh casualty of her dropping the device during the humiliating eviction process. Her cellular service was scheduled for disconnection by Friday due to non-payment. She scrolled through her contact list, her thumb passing over the names of affluent women who no longer acknowledged her existence. The isolation was profound, a suffocating vacuum that stripped away her last remaining layers of pride. She needed capital. She needed a lifeline to escape this concrete cell. Her mind raced, sifting through the wreckage of her family, until she landed on the only viable option remaining. She navigated to an archived email thread from the divorce proceedings, searching for the international contact information my attorney provided for emergencies involving the children. She found the foreign digits. A wave of nausea rolled through her gut at the prospect of dialing that number. She spent 12 years treating me like a disposable subordinate, a dull corporate drone unworthy of her golden son. Now she had to beg that same woman for survival. Patricia closed her eyes, twisting the narrative in her mind to make the humiliation palatable. She convinced herself that I owed her this favor. She reasoned that we shared a familial bond, that my maternal instincts would override any lingering bitterness. She fabricated a script where she played the desperate grandmother, relying on the children to leverage my sympathy. She pressed the green call button and raised the device to her ear, her manicured nails digging into the cheap plastic casing. The Tuscan sun dipped below the rolling hills, painting the Mediterranean sky in vibrant strokes of crimson and burnt orange. I sat comfortably on the expansive stone terrace of Via Alba, enjoying the gentle evening breeze sweeping through the olive groves. A glass of crisp local white wine rested on the wrought iron table, beside a stack of profitable quarterly financial reports. The estate was operating at peak efficiency. Leo and Mia were inside the main dining hall laughing with the estate manager as they learned how to roll fresh pasta dough from scratch. The atmosphere was infused with security order and deep, resonant peace. My smartphone vibrated against the table, the screen illuminating the gathering dusk. I glanced at the display. It was an incoming international call originating from a Denver area code. I knew immediately who was on the other end of the line. Nate's phone was shut off days ago, leaving Patricia as the only remaining architect of the Colorado disaster capable of reaching out. I considered letting the device ring into the voicemail void. However, closing a ledger properly requires balancing every final equation. I picked up the phone and accepted the call, pressing the speaker to my ear without offering a greeting. Clara, a voice whimpered through the receiver, thick with heavy sobs and trembling desperation. Clara, please do not hang up on me. It was Patricia. The haughty, aristocratic sneer that defined her vocal cadence for decades was gone, replaced by the frantic, wet gasps of a drowning woman. I remained perfectly silent, letting the dead air stretch across the transatlantic connection. I know we have had our differences, Patricia continued, her words stumbling over one another in a rush of panicked bargaining. I know Nathaniel made some terrible mistakes, but we are destitute. The bank took the Cherry Creek house. We are living in a horrific slum, Clara. We have no heat. We have no food. Nathaniel will not even get out of bed. I have nowhere else to turn. I listened to her weep, my pulse remaining steady, my breathing even. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy, nor did I feel a drop of pity. I simply observed the inevitable mathematics of their choices coming to fruition. I thought about the forged appraisals, the hidden debts, and the cruel jokes they shared at my expense while spending my salary. Clara, I am begging you, the matriarch cried, abandoning every ounce of her dignity. You have so much now. I heard about the Italian estate. You are thriving. Please, just send a short-term bridge loan, just enough to get us into a decent rental property. We are family. Think of Leo and Mia. The children need their grandmother to be safe. You cannot let your own family live in the gutter. She played the designated cards exactly as I anticipated. She weaponized the children, attempting to use their innocent existence to extort my resources. She asked for a bridge loan, echoing the exact same toxic phrase her son used to steal the equity from her mansion 2 years prior. They were trapped in a loop of their own deceit, fundamentally incapable of learning from their ruin. I took a slow, measured sip of my wine, letting the cool liquid coat my throat. I looked out over the ancient, enduring landscape of Rome. When I finally spoke, I utilized my flat, polite, corporate voice. It was the same tone I used when canceling a breached vendor contract or dismissing an incompetent logistics supplier. Patricia, I said softly, slicing through her frantic weeping with surgical precision. Let us recall a specific Tuesday afternoon at the Oak Ridge Country Club. The sobbing on the other end of the line hitched, pausing as confusion temporarily overrode her panic. You cornered me on the patio in front of your wealthy friends, I continued my diction, crisp and deliberate. You told everyone I was too obsessed with my spreadsheets to keep a husband. You mocked the very labor that funded your catered luncheons and your designer wardrobe. You thought my quiet discipline was a character flaw. Patricia opened her mouth to issue a frantic apology, but I did not yield the floor. I held the line with unwavering authority. It turns out those spreadsheets were the only thing keeping a roof over your head. I stated the unvarnished truth, ringing clear across the digital connection. When I stopped managing the math, your son lost his business, his reputation, and your entire legacy in less than 30 days. You handed him the matches, and he burned your kingdom to ash. I paused, letting the heavy reality of my words settle over her suffocating Denver dwelling. The silence between us was final, marking the definitive end of my tenure as their collateral damage. "I am keeping what I built," I said, delivering the closing statement with calm, lethal finality. "You can keep what you fought for." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I immediately navigated to the settings menu and blocked the contact, severing the digital tether forever. I set the device face down on the wrought iron table and turned my attention back to the vibrant Tuscan sunset, the Colorado wreckage permanently fading from my rearview mirror. In the freezing, cramped living room of the suburban apartment, Patricia Collins sat rigid on the stained sofa. She held the dead cellular phone against her cheek, the dial tone buzzing like a mechanical insect in the stagnant air. Her mouth hung slightly open, her chest tight with a cold, hollow ache. The tears stopped falling, replaced by a profound, paralyzing shock. The brutal efficiency of my final words stripped away her remaining delusions. She could no longer blame predatory banks, spiteful lawyers, or bad luck. She was forced to look directly into the mirror. She had spent a decade harboring venom for the only individual capable of securing her survival. She encouraged her son to discard a protective fortress in exchange for a glamorous mirage. They mocked the architect, and now they were buried under the rubble of their own arrogance. The cheap radiator hissed again in the corner. The sound of a police siren wailed in the distance, underscoring the gritty, unforgiving reality of her new environment. She looked toward the closed bedroom door where her bankrupt son lay hiding from the world. There was no rescue coming. There were no hidden accounts to tap, no wealthy friends left to manipulate. The bridge was burned, the ashes scattered across an ocean she could never cross. Patricia lowered the phone to her lap, her manicured hands trembling in the dim light. The diamond rings she used to wear were sold weeks ago to cover legal fees, leaving pale indentations on her aging fingers. She looked around the claustrophobic room, taking in the peeling linoleum and the water-stained ceiling. She was permanently cut off from the woman she underestimated, left to dwell in the dark, suffocating cage she helped build. The realization settled deep within her bones, a cold and permanent truth she would carry for the rest of her days. 6 months passed since I disconnected that final phone call. The seasons shifted across the globe. The bitter, freezing winter that buried Denver in snow slowly melted away, giving way to a suffocating summer heat. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the Italian spring bloomed into a vibrant, sun-soaked Mediterranean summer. Time possesses a unique mechanism for revealing the fundamental truth of any situation. Time washes away the fragile paint of deception and exposes the iron framework beneath every human life. For my family, time served as a gentle architect, helping us construct a beautiful new reality. For the people I left behind in Colorado, time acted as a ruthless debt collector, arriving to collect every single outstanding invoice. Nathaniel Collins spent a decade wearing custom-tailored Italian wool suits and driving imported luxury vehicles. He built his entire identity around the illusion of effortless prosperity. 6 months after the commercial banks liquidated his brokerage firm, that illusion was replaced by a bleak, undeniable reality. Nate now spends his days standing on the blistering black asphalt of a discount used car dealership located on the deep industrial outskirts of the city. He wears a cheap, short-sleeve polyester uniform shirt that sticks to his skin in the afternoon heat. There are no expensive lunches at downtown steakhouses. There are no lavish engagement parties. There is only the harsh glare of the sun reflecting off the hoods of high-mileage sedans and the humiliating sting of rejection. He works a strictly commission-based sales position. Every morning he watches customers walk onto the lot, and he must put on a desperate, eager smile. He uses the same charismatic sales tactics he once utilized to sell multi-million-dollar commercial real estate, but now he uses them to push financing plans on rusted pickup trucks. The profound irony is that even when he manages to finalize a sale, he sees very little of the actual profit. The Internal Revenue Service audited his collapsed corporate accounts and discovered years of negligent accounting. The federal government placed a severe garnishment on his wages. The majority of his meager paycheck is automatically routed to the Treasury Department before he can even view the deposit. He traded a secure, quiet life funded by my logistics career for a relentless, exhausting struggle on a searing pavement. A few miles away from the dealership, Patricia sits confined within her cramped second-floor apartment. The oppressive July heat radiates through the thin drywall, turning the small living space into an unbearable oven. The cheap window air conditioning unit rattles loudly, struggling to lower the temperature, offering only a faint breeze that smells of dust and neglect. Patricia spends her days wearing a faded cotton robe, sitting on the stained thrift store sofa. She no longer receives glossy invitations to charity galas or country club luncheons. The influential women she courted for 30 years erased her contact information the moment her bank accounts ran dry. High society operates on a strict currency of perceived value, and Patricia is officially bankrupt in every possible metric. She occupies her time flipping through old velvet-bound photo albums. She looks at pictures of her grand Cherry Creek mansion, the sweeping oak staircases and the crystal chandeliers. She stares at the visual evidence of a kingdom she surrendered due to her own blind arrogance. The silence in the apartment is profound and heavy. Her phone never rings. Her golden son returns from the car lot late in the evening, smelling of cheap coffee and hot asphalt, too defeated to engage in conversation. They sit in the suffocating quiet, two ghosts haunting the remains of their own destroyed legacy. Patricia finally understands that social superiority is a fragile, hollow construct. She traded the only daughter-in-law who ever truly supported her for a young mistress who evaporated at the first sign of financial distress. Kelsey did not waste a single moment mourning the collapse of her fake millionaire groom. Women who treat relationships as financial transactions are remarkably efficient when a bad investment goes under. She severed all ties with Nate the day she threw her diamond ring onto his concrete driveway. She deleted every photograph of him from her social media profiles, scrubbing his existence from her digital history as if he were nothing more than a temporary glitch. According to the quiet murmurs of the Denver grapevine, Kelsey is already engaged to a 60-year-old orthopedic surgeon. She is currently flashing a new gemstone on the deck of a chartered yacht in Mexico, practicing her practiced smile for a brand new audience. She secured her funding, and Nate was simply discarded onto the scrap heap of her ambition. While the architects of my former misery navigated their self-imposed purgatory, my reality in Rome expanded into something magnificent. I utilized my extensive background in global supply chain management to transform Villa Alba from a quiet family retreat into a highly lucrative boutique destination. I streamlined the international booking protocols, optimized the vendor supply lines, and partnered with exclusive corporate event coordinators across Europe. The revenue generated by the estate tripled within the first quarter. I did not need to boast about my success at country club dinners. The robust, undeniable mathematics sitting in my secured European trust accounts spoke loud enough. The true triumph, however, was witnessing the profound transformation in my children. Leo and Mia shed the residual anxiety of their past life like a heavy winter coat. They are thriving in the warm Italian culture. They spend their afternoons running through the ancient piazzas, ordering fresh pastries from the local baker in fluid conversational Italian. Their faces are bright, their laughter is unfiltered, and their shoulders are free from the invisible weight of their father's toxic narcissism. They are growing up in an environment defined by stability, respect, and unconditional support. They are learning that genuine strength is quiet, deliberate, and fiercely protective. On a tranquil Tuesday evening, I sat alone on the expansive stone terrace extending from my master's suite. The sun was dipping below the Tuscan hills, casting long shadows across the olive groves. I held a glass of rich Sangiovese wine, enjoying the cool breeze drifting off the Mediterranean Sea. My silver laptop rested on the wrought iron table in front of me. A soft chime echoed from the speakers, indicating a new incoming email. I opened the message. It was a digital notification from a real estate monitoring service I had configured months ago, tracking the specific property records of the Denver market. The automated alert detailed the final disposition of the grand Cherry Creek estate, the sprawling brick mansion The very house Nate fought so viciously to steal from me during the divorce mediation had finally reached the end of its foreclosure cycle. The bank auctioned the property at a public short sale. The notification displayed the final purchase price. The estate sold to a corporate holding company for mere pennies on the dollar. The financial institution liquidated the asset just to clear the toxic debt from their ledgers. I read the numbers on the screen twice, letting the sheer poetry of the moment wash over me. Nate demanded the kingdom, believing the walls were made of solid gold. He forced me out, assuming he was the brilliant victor. Now, a faceless corporation owned the hardwood floors where he hosted his arrogant parties, and Nate was renting a decaying apartment with his destitute mother. The trap we built had executed its final, flawless mechanism. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my wine. The vintage was complex, earthy, and perfectly balanced. I looked out over the ancient, enduring landscape of Rome, a city built on foundations that survived millennia of conflict. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, feeling a profound sense of closure. If you are listening to this story right now and you find yourself trapped in a room with people who constantly underestimate your intelligence, I want you to remember the fundamental lesson of my journey. The loudest person in the room is almost always hiding the deepest deficit. They use volume, cruelty, and manipulation to mask their own glaring incompetence. When they try to diminish your value, your initial instinct might be to scream back to defend your honor or to fight a chaotic war on their terms. Resist that urge. Silence is never a sign of weakness. When deployed correctly, silence is the most devastating strategy you can possess. It provides you with the crucial space required to audit your reality, to gather your resources, and to build an unbreakable exit plan. You do not need to seek loud, dramatic revenge. You do not need to actively destroy your enemies. The ultimate revenge is simply stepping out of their way. You remove the silent, competent labor that props up their fragile illusions. You hand them the heavy burden of their own arrogance, and you let them carry it. You allow them to destroy themselves with their own unchecked greed, while you quietly redirect your energy toward building a beautiful, secure life they can never touch. Thank you for spending your time with me today. If this narrative resonated with your own experiences, or if you know a quiet woman who needs a reminder of her own hidden power, please share this with her. Drop a comment below and let me know the most valuable lesson you learned from walking away. Hit the like button, subscribe to Cutie Told Stories, and keep your records meticulous. I will see you in the next one.